Testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing, 1, 2, 3.
This committee will come to order. Despite the warnings issued and despite the sanctions imposed by the U.S. and our allies, we continue to see aggression against Ukraine. This is a crisis with violence intensifying, the presence of heavy weapons, and the downing of Ukrainian helicopters betray the Kremlin's claim that it is not behind the unrest. Unfortunately, President Vladimir Putin appears to have calculated that the price will be bearable, and this has to change. The ranking member and I led a delegation to Ukraine last month where we heard loud and clear the desire for strong American leadership. Fortunately, we have something to work with. The Russian economy is weakening due to the Ukraine crisis. Russia's own central bank has said that $63.7 billion in capital has fled the country in the first quarter, a figure that the IMF predicts will reach $100 billion by the end of this year. The Russian stock market, since the beginning of the year, has dropped 16% of its value, and the ruble has also lost much of its value as interest rates have risen. The World Bank has warned that Russia's growth rate this year could become negative. Much of this economic weakness is driven by the political risk of doing business in Russia. Investors hate risk. We should do more to increase their risk perception if the Russian government attempts to undermine the election on May 25th. That is a very important election. We spent time in the easternmost part of Ukraine, and the information that we received from talking to every group that we could access was that they were looking forward to the election. They felt the election would pull the country together. I think there will be a big turnout on May 25th as long as it is not destabilized. We must stop reacting to Putin's moves while waiting patiently for the Europeans to join us. Instead, we must adopt a proactive strategy that will convince President Putin that his aggression will have a significant and lasting cost to the Russian economy and ultimately to his rule should he intervene in that election. We must also undermine Russia's ability to use its oil and gas exports to offset its economic weakness. Oil and gas make up over half of Russia's national budget. It is 52% of the support for the military and the government there. It is 70% of the exports. President Putin understands that he is vulnerable to even small reductions in energy revenues. To accomplish this longer-term goal of leverage, we must enhance energy efficiency in Ukraine and other countries that have traditionally depended on subsidized Russian energy exports in Eastern Europe. We must assist European countries in developing their own energy resources. When we were there, we talked at length with the government in Ukraine about the ability to develop shale gas in the western part of that country and to bring new sources of energy to the European market, including through expediting the approval of LNG export facilities and ending the U.S. ban on crude oil exports. Both in Poland and in Lithuania, they are working on bringing online a receipt station for LNG by the end of the year, and the reality is that they're very desirous, since we have a glut on our market, of having exports come from the United States into Eastern Europe. As you know, the Poles can directly flow that gas into Ukraine. By allowing abundant U.S. energy resources to flow to Europe, we can help end energy dependency on Russia, helping to weaken Moscow's economic and political grip of its neighbors. We must also expand and sharpen our international broadcasting to Russia and to Ukraine and others in the region in order to counter the propaganda that Moscow is peddling to spread instability and fear that it can then exploit. One of the most important things that can happen here is if we get back up on our feet with the type of effective broadcasting Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty used to do into that part of the world. So this committee just passed and the President signed legislation to improve broadcasting into Ukraine. We are in an information war, and we are looking to see what else is needed in this effort to have surrogate radio bring real news in real time in terms of what is actually happening in the eastern part of the country and in Russia into that region. It is essential that the U.S. reinforce our defense commitment to our NATO allies, such as Poland and Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia, to ensure that President Putin does not miscalculate and initiate a far more serious confrontation. But our NATO allies must take long overdue steps to increase their defense spending to 3% of GDP. I feel that there are some real challenges here, and I fear that our failure to match our warnings with equally strong action has undermined our credibility in some ways. It is my hope that we can restore our credibility by convincing President Putin that he is indeed risking his future in pursuit of objectives that are unworthy of a great nation. I now turn to the ranking member, Mr. Elliot Engel of New York, for his remarks.
Well, thank you, Chairman Royce, for calling this hearing. The situation in Ukraine is one of the most urgent issues for American foreign policy. Madam Assistant Secretary and Mr. Assistant Secretary, thank you both for appearing before the committee today, and thank you for your hard work in support of Ukraine. I also want to acknowledge the presence here this morning of Ukrainian Ambassador Motzik, who's in the audience. Welcome, Mr. Ambassador. Right now, Ukrainian troops are battling separatists in eastern Ukraine. The people of Odessa, the vibrant multicultural birthplace of one of my grandparents, are mourning those killed last weekend. Tensions are high, and there is a danger of further escalation in certain parts of the country. I want to express my condolences to the families of those who were killed. It's clear that President Putin is responsible for this crisis. He has trampled on Ukraine's sovereignty. He has illegally seized Crimea, the first annexation in Europe since the end of World War II. He has tried to instigate separatism and destabilize the country, and he has massed his troops on Ukraine's border, promoted discord and conflict, and set individuals, families, and peoples against one another. Meanwhile, the people of Ukraine are trying to chart a new course for their country's future. The interim government in Kyiv has done all it can to maintain stability, and the presidential election scheduled for May 25th give Ukraine a path forward for a democratic return to political and economic health. Chairman Royce and I, along with several other colleagues on this committee, recently visited Kyiv. We heard the same thing over and over again. Ukrainians do not want Russian interference, and they resent Russian attempts to tear their country apart. The people of Ukraine are looking to us and our allies to ensure Putin's attempts to weaken their country do not succeed. The reality hit home for me when we visited a synagogue in eastern Ukraine. Two older men approached me to talk about the crisis. They had seen it all. They fought against Hitler's army in World War II to stop the spread of tyranny, only to find themselves living under the yoke of Soviet dictatorship for the next half-century. They saw the wall crumble and felt the breeze of freedom and democracy blow across Eastern Europe. And there, wearing the medals they had earned on the Ukrainian front, they were looking toward the east and seeing an all-too-familiar threat on the horizon. "Don't abandon us," one of them said. Like so many others, those men want Ukraine to thrive in peace and prosperity. We need to have their backs. So President Putin must understand that his actions have consequences. The White House did right by imposing targeted sanctions against individuals and companies associated with Putin, and yesterday withdrawing Russia as a GSP beneficiary. But if Russia continues to threaten and destabilize Ukraine, we need to ratchet up the pressure further. We need stronger sanctions. I also call on our European partners and others around the world to work with us in imposing sanctions. But sanctions will only be effective if they are part of a broader strategy on Ukraine and Russia. First, the best answer to Russian aggression is for Ukraine to become a fully democratic, prosperous state. Wouldn't it be nice if Putin's aggression accelerated the process of democratization of Ukraine and made Ukraine look westward rather than eastward. That's why I support robust international assistance, including the U.S. and EU, and centered on the IMF agreement to address Ukraine's immediate economic crisis. Next, serious reform efforts. We should help Ukraine address structural economic weaknesses, combat corruption, secure its borders, rebuild its military, strengthen rule of law, and increase its energy security. Secondly, to answer future threats from Russia, we need to focus on the role of a 21st century NATO. Even as NATO addresses challenges around the world, the alliance has to remain the guarantor of peace and security in Europe. NATO allies, especially those on the eastern side of the alliance, must be confident that Article 5 guarantees remain in force. NATO needs to ramp up cooperative activities in Central Europe. We need to take a hard look at NATO's force posture and defensive assets in the region. And most importantly, all 28 NATO allies need to live up to their responsibilities. Right now, only 4 countries devote at least 2% of their budgets to defense, as they have committed to do by being a member of NATO. If we increase NATO defense spending while joining in a coordinated embargo on all arms sales to Russia, including halting the sale of 2 French-built Mistral amphibious ships, it will send a clear message to Putin that he will not be allowed to trample on the rights of his neighbors. On that note, I think the U.S. and our allies should work with Paris to find a way for NATO to purchase or lease these advanced warships to expand our capabilities while preventing their delivery to Moscow. Third, in addition to helping Ukraine increase its energy security, we must urgently work with our European allies and others to reduce Europe's energy dependence on Russia. And finally, we need to help ensure that the May 25th elections in Ukraine are safe, free, and fair, and reflect the will of the people of Ukraine. We hope that Ukraine's new president will begin the process of reconciliation by making clear that he or she represents all Ukrainians, regardless of their regional, ethnic, or religious identity. Ukrainians need to work together to build a tolerant, pluralistic society. The new Ukrainian government must be truly inclusive, support minority rights, and condemn all forms of intolerance. As I heard repeatedly while in Ukraine, there is strong support for constitutional reforms and decentralization to give greater powers to regional and municipal authorities. I want to emphasize that Ukraine's future is for Ukrainians alone to decide. At the same time, a lasting solution ensuring the stability of Ukraine requires Russia's cooperation. So we must continue to talk with Russia and facilitate direct talks between Moscow and Kyiv, including through international and regional fora such as the UN and OSCE. I'd like to close by again thanking our witnesses and the administration for all the work over the past several months to support democracy in Ukraine. This is a very difficult time for Ukraine, and it is important that its people know they have a friend in the United States. We support their country's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and we support the aspirations of Ukrainians to build a better future for their country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, Mr. Engel. I do want to again thank Elliot Engel for his assistance on this CODEL and some of our other colleagues here as well, Lois Frankel, Alan Lowenthal, Judge Ted Poe, Mike Quigley, Jim Gerlach, David Cicilline. We appreciate the members of this committee and some of our other colleagues in the House for their engagement. I now go for 2 minutes to Mr. Rohrbacher, Chair of the Europe and Eurasia Subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just happen to be chairman of this subcommittee at this particular moment in history. How interesting. I think that we should all understand that the situation in Ukraine is much murkier than what is being presented by the rhetoric that we hear every day. This is not simply a case of Russian aggression. This all began. When did this crisis begin? When did the chaos that we see begin? We began when an elected president of Ukraine, who was probably elected in the fairest and most honest election Ukraine has ever had, when that president, Yanukovych, was forced out of office by street violence. That's when this chaos started. So let's not say, oh my goodness, the Russians are responsible for all this problem that's going on. The fact is, it started before there was any Russian intervention at all, when an elected president was thrown out, and my gosh, the United States didn't seem to be concerned that this elected person in a free election was being kicked out by, which basically was based on street violence that created a chaotic situation in which, of course, we ended up with what? And when was that street violence? When did it start? It started when the elected president decided, as he rightfully was elected to do, to make an economic agreement with Russia rather than the EU. Now, this is much, much murkier than what's being presented. One thing is for sure, we should not be jumping into it. We should not be borrowing, and I'm looking forward to the testimony of our witnesses today to find out exactly how much this is costing the American taxpayer. When we are going into debt by hundreds of billions of dollars a year, for us to borrow more money in order to give it to Ukraine in situations like this doesn't make much sense. But I'm anxious to hear what our witnesses have to say about how much this is costing the United States. So with that, I thank the chairman for holding this hearing. I'm interested in learning as much as I can, and thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. We now go to 2 minutes to Mr. Keating, a ranking member of the Europe-Eurasia Subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to begin by thanking Assistant Secretary Newland and Assistant Secretary Glazer for appearing today. I have seen firsthand, both in Europe and back home, how they and their teams of experts have been working overtime for the past 6 months to respond quickly and constantly to the changing situation in Ukraine. Ambassador Payet and his team embassy in Kyiv merit special recognition for their heroic efforts. I'm looking forward to hearing our witnesses' assessment of Russia's efforts to destabilize Ukraine's interim government and the effectiveness to date of U.S. sanctions. Despite its April 17th pledge to help de-escalate the crisis in Ukraine, Russia has done exactly the opposite. There is nothing murky about that. It is clear as can be. The role that Russian special services have played in destabilizing eastern Ukraine is indisputable in supporting so-called separatist coordinated armed attacks on government buildings and in orchestrating kidnappings and violence against local politicians, reporters, and even OSCE monitors. Russian disinformation campaigns have only made matters worse, and I echo the sentiments of the chairman of this committee as this committee has moved forward in a bipartisan effort to increase international broadcasting. Russian forces' use of masked warfare and other covert tactics seem to signal a strategic shift in its approach to the region and to European security. It is essential that the United States and NATO allies respond. I support the administration's decision to impose sanctions on individuals and entities closely linked to the Russian leadership's inner circle. I also welcome the decision to impose export restrictions on key Russian companies and the additional restrictive measures on defense exports. The goal of these targeted sanctions is to send a clear signal that Russian aggression against Ukraine comes at a price. I share the President's hope that these measures will persuade President Putin to reverse course. While President Putin's statement today is a hopeful sign, his true intentions remain unclear. I am troubled by separatists' insistence that they move ahead with a referendum this weekend, and I therefore fully support the administration's readiness to impose additional penalties if Russia continues to press forward, including targeted sanctions against specific sectors of the Russian economy. As the United States moves forward, it is imperative that we do so in coordination with our European allies, and I look forward to hearing about the status of the administration's ongoing discussions with the EU, as well as efforts within NATO to counter Russian aggression and reassure our Central European and Baltic allies. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman, and this morning we're pleased to be joined by representatives of the Department of State and the Department of Treasury. Ms. Victoria Newland, before assuming her position as Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs at the Department of State, she served as the Department of State's spokesperson. She also served as the United States Permanent Representative to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization from 2005 to 2008, focusing heavily on NATO-Russia issues, among other distinguished roles. Mr. Daniel Glazer, prior to his confirmation as Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing in the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence in the Department of Treasury, he served as the first Director of the Treasury's Executive Office of Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes and was an attorney for the U.S. Secret Service. We worked with Mr. Glazer some years ago because he was heavily involved in U.S. efforts to target North Korea with financial sanctions when he caught them in the act of counterfeiting $100 bills in Macau. Macau was laundering the bills from North Korea into the financial system, and the sanctions put on that bank and 10 other banks until they were lifted by the Department of State were particularly effective in stopping hard currency flows into North Korea. Without objection, the witness's full prepared statement will be made part of the record. Members will have 5 calendar days to submit statements and questions, extraneous materials for the record if you wish. And Ambassador Newland, if you would, please summarize your remarks to 5 minutes, and then we'll go to Mr. Glazer and then to questions.
Thank you, Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, members of this committee for inviting us today. As you said, Mr. Chairman, I've submitted a far more detailed statement for the record. Let me begin by expressing my gratitude for the strong bipartisan engagement of this committee in support of Ukraine and its people. Your passage of the U.S. loan guarantee legislation demonstrated the American people's commitment to help Ukraine at this critical time, and your visits to Kyiv and to Dnipropetrovsk reinforce America's solidarity with the Ukrainian people and made an enormous impact on the ground. So thank you to all of you who traveled and to the bipartisan leadership of this committee. Today, I want to outline 4 pillars of U.S. policy to address the challenges that we face in Ukraine. First, the United States is supporting Ukraine with financial, technical, and non-lethal security assistance as it prepares for the Democratic presidential elections on May 25th. And we agree with you, Mr. Chairman, these are absolutely the most vital elections Ukraine has had in recent history. Second, we're working with Ukraine and our European partners to leave the door open for diplomatic de-escalation should Russia change course and make a serious effort to implement its April 17 Geneva commitments. Third, we're steadily raising the economic costs for Russia's occupation and illegal annexation of Crimea and any continuing efforts to destabilize eastern and southern Ukraine. And fourth, we're stepping up our efforts to reassure our NATO allies. So let me go through them quickly. First, in addition to the $1 billion loan guarantee approved on April 1st, the United States is providing $178 million in FY13 and 14 state and AID funds, plus an additional $50 million in technical assistance to support programs to maintain macroeconomic stability, to advance anti-corruption reform, to mitigate the vulnerability of Ukraine to outside economic pressure, especially from Russia, especially in the energy sector, and to support energy efficiency, and to recover stolen assets of the Ukrainian state and the Ukrainian people. We're also providing more than $18 million in non-lethal security assistance to the Ukrainian Armed Forces and the State Border Guard Service. Our $11 million in electoral assistance supports efforts at voter education and civic participation. It assists the Central Electoral Commission to administer the elections effectively and transparently. It supports election security, which will be absolutely essential, and it guarantees a diverse, balanced, and policy-focused media. We're also supporting 255 long-term local observers and over 3,300 short-term observers. In addition, we're working with the OSCE's Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, ODIHR, as they prepare to deploy 1,000 observers throughout the country monitoring the elections, the largest monitoring effort in ODIHR's history. Second, along with our allies and the international community, we remain committed to a diplomatic de-escalation should that be possible. As you know, on April 17th in Geneva, the United States, Ukraine, Russia, and the EU came together to develop a blueprint for such de-escalation. At its core, the Geneva Joint Statement was and remains a grand bargain that offered amnesty for those who vacate seized buildings, plus deep, broad decentralization of power to Ukraine's regions through national dialogue and constitutional reform, in parallel with an end to violence, intimidation, and the seizure of buildings and weapons. As you know, the Ukrainian government began implementing its part of the Geneva Agreement even before the ink was dry on the text. The day after, the Ukrainian government sent a draft amnesty bill to the Rada. Within a week, Ukrainian authorities had dismantled barricades in Kyiv and opened streets. On April 14th, 29th, and just yesterday, the Constitutional Reform Commission has held broad public conferences with all the regions, and Ukrainian security forces instituted an Easter pause in their operations and sent senior officials out with the OSCE teams to Donetsk and Slavyansk and Luhansk and other embattled cities to try to talk separatists into pursuing their aims politically rather than through violence. And you will have seen the trip of Prime Minister Yatsenyuk to the most embattled area of the East, Slavyansk, yesterday on a mission of political reconciliation. In contrast, Russia has fulfilled none of its commitments. The separatists in Donetsk and Luhansk told OSCE observers that they hadn't even received any messages at all from Russia urging them to stand down. Yesterday was, in fact, the first time we heard President Putin call for the illegally armed groups to stand down. Instead, since April 17th, all the efforts of Ukraine and the OSCE have been met with more violence, more mayhem, kidnappings, torture, and death. As Secretary Kerry has stated, we continue to have high confidence that Russia's hand is behind this instability. And yet, Russia can still step back from supporting separatism and violence. Today, we are working closely with the government of Ukraine, with the OSCE, with key European governments, including Germany, to once again support a diplomatic path forward, a rejuvenation, if you will, of the Geneva commitments. We do consider it a positive step that President Putin yesterday spoke out in opposition to the proposed May 11th separatist referendum in Donetsk and Luhansk. Now, what we hope to see is Moscow completely end its support for separatists altogether and actively encourage an end to building occupations, disarmament of illegal groups, and the healing of Ukraine through the political process. That means presidential elections, national dialogue on broad constitutional reform through decentralization. This is the peaceful path forward. And we will judge Russia's sincerity by its actions in coming days, not by its words. This brings me to the third pillar of our strategy. In response to Russia's continued occupation of Crimea and its aggressive acts in East and South Ukraine, the United States has imposed significant costs on Russia. Just last week, we enacted new sanctions on 7 Russian government officials, including 2 members of Putin's inner circle and 17 entities. Assistant Secretary Glazer will go into the details. And as the President made clear last week, we are prepared to exact a higher cost if Russia takes further steps to destabilize Ukraine, including disrupting the May 25th elections. And we are working now with our European and global partners on a package of sectoral sanctions that will bite quite deeply into the Russian economy if we have to use them. The Russian economy, as you said, Mr. Chairman, is already buckling under the pressure of these internationally imposed sanctions. Its credit ratings are hovering just above junk status. $51 billion in capital has fled Russia since the beginning of the year, which is close to the $60 billion they lost in 2013, in all of 2013. Russian bonds are trading at higher yields than any debt in Europe, And as the ruble has fallen, the central bank has raised interest rates twice and has spent close to $30 billion from its reserves since early March to try to prop up the ruble. And finally, our fourth pillar. We're working intensively with our NATO allies to provide visible reassurance on land, on sea, and in the air that Article 5 of the NATO treaty means what it says. Our message to Russia is clear. NATO territory is inviolable. We will defend every piece of it. And we're mounting a visible deterrent to any Russian efforts to test that. The United States, as you know, has increased our own contribution to NATO Baltic air policing. We've bolstered the U.S.-Poland aviation detachment at Wask Air Force Base, and we've maintained a steady U.S. naval presence in the Black Sea. And we've also deployed a total of 750 U.S. ground troops to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Romania. We're now heartened that more than half of the other NATO allies have also offered visible reassurance contributions to the NATO mission to support the frontline states, including increased air and land reassurances by the UK, France, Canada, and Germany, and reassurances at sea from Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Estonia. Taken together, these four pillars of our policy, support for Ukraine, costs for Russia, an open door for de-escalation through diplomacy, and allied reassurance are the foundation of the work we are doing together and with this committee and with the Congress. In this effort, we appreciate your bipartisan support and your bipartisan contribution, and we hope to continue to work closely with you. Thank you.
Mr. Glazer.
Thank you, Chairman Royce, and thank you for that kind of introduction. I'm going to go off script just for a second to thank you for recalling the work that we did together in 2005, 2006, 2007. That really was the proof of concept that it is possible to apply targeted financial measures in a strategic way against a target, and we learned a lot from that, and we've really taken off since then, and it was a pleasure working with you back then. I look forward.
I just wish we had done it again, Mr. Glazer.
Well, we're doing our best, Mr. Chairman. But to my remarks, Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to speak today about the U.S. government's response to Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and its continued provocative actions in Ukraine. The Department of the Treasury is designing and implementing a strategy that uses targeted financial measures to raise the costs to Russia of its actions. Our approach is calibrated to impose immediate costs on Russia and to create conditions that will make Russia increasingly vulnerable to sanctions as the situation in Ukraine escalates. To this end, Treasury has targeted not only corrupt former Ukrainian officials, Crimean separatists, and their backers in the Russian government, but individuals in President Putin's inner circle who have important interests in holding throughout the Russian economy. Russia is already feeling the impact of our measures. In my remarks today, I will describe Treasury's sanctions tools and how we are deploying them. I will also discuss the important measures we are taking to buttress the Ukrainian economy. By pursuing these dual tracks, the Treasury Department is using the tools at our disposal to contribute to the development of a strong and sovereign Ukraine. President Obama has signed 3 executive orders that provide the Secretary of the Treasury with expanded authority to sanction individuals responsible for the continuation of the crisis in Ukraine, as well as entities under their control. In total, we have designated 45 individuals and 19 entities over 4 tranches of designations. The most important of these targets include those in Putin's inner circle and the companies they control or own. These include Igor Sechin, the chairman of the state-run oil company Rosneft, Sergei Chemezov, the CEO of the Russian weapons and metals conglomerate Rostec, and Gennady Timchenko, who ran Gunvor, one of the world's largest commodity trading firms. We've also targeted Russian officials directing the annexation of Crimea, as well as Crimean separatists and former Ukrainian government officials. We have a range of options we can deploy should Russia's leadership continue to destabilize Ukraine. For example, Treasury has additional authority authorized by President Obama under Executive Order 13662 to significantly enhance Russia's economic costs and isolation. This executive order authorizes the targeting of entities operating in broad sectors of the Russian economy, such as defense, metals, mining, finance, engineering, and energy. I should note the importance of coordination with our international partners, particularly those in the European Union and the G7. To be clear, the United States always stands ready to take actions we deem necessary to safeguard our national security and to safeguard international security. We do, however, recognize that our financial measures are more powerful and effective when done in a multilateral framework. Our partners have taken sanctions measures of their own, and they have started to prepare to do more. We are working to ensure that our international partners continue and expand their measures and that we move forward together to address Russia's aggression. For example, this week, Undersecretary David Cohen is leading an interagency delegation in Europe to coordinate precisely this, going to stops such as London, Paris, and Berlin. But even as we lay the groundwork for expanded measures if necessary, our sanctions are having an impact on Russia's already weak economy. And actually, Chairman Royce rattled off most of the numbers that I have to rattle off, but I'll do it again because I do think they bear repeating. As sanctions increase, the costs to Russia will not only increase, but their ability to mitigate the costs that they incur will diminish. Already, market analysts are forecasting significant continued outflows of both foreign and domestic capital and a further weakening of growth prospects for the year. The Russian stock market has declined over 13%, and the Russian currency has depreciated by almost 8% since the beginning of the year, the worst numbers within the group of emerging markets. The IMF has downgraded Russia's growth outlook to 0.2% this year. That's the second downgrade within a month, and they've suggested that a recession is not out of the question. This stands in stark contrast to previous IMF forecasts, which as recently as February were projecting 2% growth for Russia. The IMF also indicated that they expect as much as $100 billion in capital flight from Russia this year, which has caused rating agencies such as Standard & Poor's to downgrade Russia's sovereign credit rating to just above junk status. In addition to our measures to isolate the Russian economy, the Department of the Treasury is working with the international community to support the Ukrainian government in returning the country's economy to solid footing. As an important first step, Ukraine received the first tranche of $3 billion from the IMF's two-year $17 billion reform package, with an additional $3 billion expected to be dispersed by the end of May. Treasury is also offering its expertise in identifying, tracking, and recovering stolen Ukrainian assets in support of Department of Justice efforts. Expert Treasury advisors have also been deployed to Kiev to help the Ukrainian authorities stabilize the financial sector and implement reforms. As the United States and our international partners continue to confront Russia's illegal actions in Ukraine, we stand ready to further employ our arsenal of financial measures as the situation escalates. A diplomatic resolution of the crisis remains our goal, but if Russia chooses to continue its illegal and destabilizing actions in Ukraine, we can impose substantial costs on and expand the isolation of an already weak Russian economy. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and I would be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Glazer. From our standpoint, and I think it's pretty clear to the members here, our goal is to get a resolution to this thing as quickly as possible, to get some measure of reconciliation. The presidential candidates that are running on May 25th, they're mature candidates. They're going to push for the use of both Ukrainian and Russian. If we can get to the May 25th election, I think you've got a chance there for a huge turnout. When we were in Dnipropetrovsk, when we were meeting with these Russian-speaking associations and representatives of women's groups and representatives of the Jewish community and other minority communities, the uniform position, especially the different NGO groups, was that they were manning these ballot box stations to make certain that there was security for those who go to the polls. Now, if you get the kind of turnout that at least we see in polling is anticipated, and you have this presidential election followed by the election of local representatives from every district, and I think we're on our way potentially to a system where we can begin to de-escalate this. We have one big problem for the attempt by journalists to cover this story in the East, and that is the disappearance of these journalists. We've got several journalists who have been disappeared by Russian separatists, taking them in custody. And the campaign of intimidation, of course, is intended to shutter all indigenous outlets for uncensored news and information. You've already got a seizure of the local broadcasting systems. So suddenly it becomes very, very important to support journalists going in to cover this election and also to counter Russian propaganda. And that takes me to an issue I wanted to talk to Ambassador Nuland about. The propaganda that you hear coming out of that part of the world is really an overdrive. Our committee recently passed legislation that's now signed into law directing U.S. international broadcasts to be ramped up. We're working on legislation to revamp and cut the bureaucracy. over the top of Radio Free Europe and other surrogate broadcasters so that they can do the type of job they've done in the past. And I was going to ask you, Ambassador, how do you assess our efforts in this information battle? How important do you think this is in terms of being able to get a flow of information into eastern Ukraine especially, so that people have the coverage going up to the election? Because I think once the election occurs, and the other thing I'll ask you to comment on, President Putin said, in reference to the May election, as you quoted him, that he does not want to go forward with a referendum on the 11th. That is very good news, okay? But he also said he thinks the presidential election on May 25th is a step in the right direction. If we can build on this statement to get a huge turnout, I think it increases the leverage for those in country, in the East and the West, who want to see a reconciliation.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We couldn't agree with you more that what is most important, if you want to hear what the people of Ukraine have to say about their future, is to let them vote. Let them vote across the country, and most especially in the east and south of Ukraine. I can talk at some length about how the OSCE assesses the electoral environment, which is surprisingly good, with the exception of Crimea, of course, where people will have to be offered a place outside Crimea to vote, and the Ukrainians are working on that, and a few of the most dangerous parts of Donetsk, including Slavyansk. But the Ukrainians, in fact, Secretary Kerry spoke this morning to Prime Minister Yatsenyuk just before I came over here, and one of the things that the Ukrainians are very focused on now is a Get Out the Vote campaign across the country. That speaks to the second part of your question, which is about free media. Would that Russia allowed it, would that the separatists allowed it, this would be the freest media environment Ukraine has ever enjoyed for an election. But as you know, it is precisely that free media environment that is threatening to this illegally armed movement. And that's why some of the sites of occupation have included TV towers in Donetsk Oblast and in Luhansk. The government's made a good effort to try to reclaim some of those, but when separatists seize TV towers, they close out plurality of voices, and the Russian propaganda megaphone is the only thing that can be heard. So we are very grateful to this committee. We're very grateful to the Congress for the support that you're showing for the programming we are helping the Ukrainians support. We recently increased by $1.5 million our support to Ukrainian government efforts to help prepare for the election and get truth out across. We're also, as you know, running and working on a very intensive effort with our allies and partners to support those voices trying to correct Russia's false narratives. I think you've probably seen our United for Ukraine campaign, which is now only 5% government content. The other 95% is taken up by global supporters of Ukraine. So these efforts are very important, but we're going to have to do more if we are now back to the future and in a propaganda environment where truth is not an obstacle.
You gave us some numbers on the number of election observers that were being fielded out of by NGO groups in the U.S., and there's several thousand coming from Europe. Do you have any estimate of how many NGO or how many volunteers, election observers, we're going to have on the ground in eastern Ukraine in order to try to monitor, and in southern Ukraine?
I don't yet have a breakdown from the OSCE on their monitor posture, but I think it'll be distributed across the country. With 1,000 OSCE across the country, we would expect at least 500 of those in the south and the east. But that's the OSCE alone. As I said, we are supporting some 3,300 indigenous Ukrainian NGO observers, and they will be spread up across the country. And that's before you get to what IRI, NDI, and like institutions across Europe and from other countries will send. So as I said, we expect this to be the best observed election in the transatlantic space since the end of the Cold War per capita.
Thank you, Ambassador Nuland. My time's expired. We'll go to Mr. Engel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and once again, thanks both of you for the very, very fine work that you're both doing. The equation for NATO since the fall of the Soviet Union has essentially been looking at Russia as a partner, at least some kind of a partner. If this is no longer the case, and Russia is now an adversary, not a partner, it changes the whole equation. When we speak to the representatives of countries like Moldova, and Georgia, and Romania, Latvia, Lithuania, they're all scared to death. And Russia's been pressuring them, and we can only expect this pressure to increase in the coming months, particularly Moldova and Georgia. So what are we doing to support the rights of the people in these states, in the region, to choose their own futures and build democratic states? Because I really believe that if we don't step up to the plate on this, you can almost kiss NATO goodbye, because if we're not going to back up what we say we stand for, then I think Putin will have won. So I just think it's absolutely imperative that we reassure the other countries in the surrounding region, who all come to see all of us and tell us that they have terrible fears of being collateral damage in this whole process.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. First, as I said, with regard to those countries who are members of the alliance, from the Baltic all the way down to the Black Sea, NATO is scoping and already deploying a massive reassurance mission on land, air, and sea. I gave some details of that in my opening statement. We expect that mission to continue through the end of 2014, and we expect heads of state and government, when they meet in Wales, to review whether it needs to continue beyond that. So Article 5, the traditional Article 5 reassurance of NATO, is now going to be at a co-equal pillar yet again at the summit. With regard to the states who are partners of NATO, Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine itself, as you know, we have greatly increased our economic, our energy support to countries like Moldova, who are most vulnerable to Russian pressure. I have been out there twice. Secretary Kerry's been out there. A number of members of Congress have been out to support them. The Prime Minister of Moldova was received in the White House, including by President Obama. We're working with them on first diversifying their market away from Russia. As you know, the EU has now granted visa-free status to Moldova. We're working to help them to explain and advance the benefits of Europe, including to the people of Transnistria. And we have worked a lot on imports of Moldovan wine, on energy interconnectors between Moldova and Romania to help them with reverse flow, et cetera, and reduce their energy dependence. So those efforts will continue. In Georgia as well, the new Prime Minister was here. We've had repeated visits, including my own out there and those of members of Congress. And we're working with them primarily on strengthening rule of law, helping them prepare for their association agreement and to really maximize the trade and people-to-people benefits of their association with Europe.
I want to thank you. I want to ask you also a question about foreign assistance, because in recent years it's diminished greatly for Central Europe and Eastern Europe. There have been some improvements in some countries, but in others needs have increased, and at the same time, the budget sequester, which I think was a disaster. There's been excessive budget cutting to these countries as a result. So is the United States providing adequate assistance for Ukraine and other Eastern European countries now under Russian pressure and trying to consolidate their democracies? And if Congress provided more assistance, would that help our efforts? And what would be the effect on U.S. and regional security, and what types of efforts might expanded assistance provide?
Thank you, Congressman. As you know, from your own efforts in Europe, once countries join the European Union, they graduate from U.S. assistance. So at the current moment, we don't provide much U.S. bilateral assistance. There are some programs that are active, but very few for any of the countries that are currently in the European Union. So our focus is to the east. It is certainly the case that in my budget, in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs, we are shaking out the couch cushions and scraping the side of the pot to get more support of the kind I discussed for Ukraine in the first instance, but also for Moldova, for Georgia, for increasing U.S. trade opportunities for countries like Armenia that are feeling increasingly squeezed. With more, we could obviously do more. I want to just briefly mention another threat that I would like to have more resources to combat, and that's the threat of corruption. We see a new tool of outside influence, not just in the post-Soviet space, but increasingly in Central Europe and the Balkans, which is this corrupt, oligarchical practices, dirty money flowing into these countries, buying politicians, then going into parliaments and dismantling democratic structures, dismantling free media, dismantling protections for NGOs. I believe the United States has to do more to help countries across the European and Eurasian space resist this pernicious cancer of corruption, which is also a tool of outside influence and a threat to sovereignty for many of them.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Engel. The Chair recognizes herself for 5 minutes. The situation in Ukraine is indeed a powder keg ready to explode at any given moment. Putin is an unrepentant thug with an expansionist ideology who has thus far proven that he will not be deterred by the actions that the U.S. has taken in response to his aggressive moves in Ukraine. And this is extremely dangerous for the stability of Ukraine and indeed the entire region. His actions have been meant to destabilize Ukraine, foment pro-nationalist and anti-Western sentiments in Russia, and manufacture a crisis so that he can play the role of a hero at home. By creating this crisis, Putin is trying to mask the ills that he faces at home, and who better to play his foil than us here in the United States. With a growing number of Russians dissatisfied with the economy and his policies, the latest news that Putin is now supporting the May 25 election must be taken with a grain of salt, because there are surely ulterior motives at play here. I congratulate this committee under the leadership of Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel for the tough but fair bills that we have passed. Our President has issued several executive orders imposing sanctions on Russian officials, and that has gained some support in the EU. But I wanted to focus on the EU part. We've been unable to get the EU on board for stronger, more effective sanctions. So following up on your testimony, what more do we need to do to get the EU on board to impose additional sanctions? What are the major concerns and obstacles in getting the EU's backing? And we had talked about Undersecretary Cohen's trip. What specifically will the Secretary be pushing in his trip to Germany, France, and the UK? And there clearly has to be a U.S. strategy for dealing with Russia and a separate strategy towards Ukraine, but they must work together in order for us to be our most effective. I believe that the administration is not willing to be strong enough in the face of Putin's aggression, doesn't wish to cause any more friction with Moscow, so we will then fall short of what is necessary to truly help the people of Ukraine who oppose Russian meddling over its sovereignty. But perhaps the administration is unwilling to stand up to Putin's aggression because they're worried that we need his support for the chemical weapons program in Syria and our misguided negotiations with Iran over the nuclear program. And if that's the case, then that just shows the consequences of our failed leadership, the fact that we're so desperate to keep a bad nuclear deal with Iran alive that we can't help those who are seeking our assistance because we don't want to upset Moscow too much. Last month, there were reports that our Department of Energy informed a Russian state-run nuclear Corporation on suspension of cooperation projects. Can you provide us with an update on the status of our 123 agreement with Russia, and is there any discussion about re-examining our PNTR agreement with Moscow? So EU, Undersecretary Cohen's trip, and 123 and MPTR. Thank you.
Thank you, Congresswoman. On 123 and PNTR, I'm going to take the question. I frankly am not as briefed as I need to be. With regard to the EU, why don't I start, and then Assistant Secretary Glazer pick up. As you know, in the rounds of sanctions that we have had, we have been able to move with the Europeans. Their legislation, their legal base is somewhat different than ours. The procedures are different. So it has been a matter of constant consultation with them to try to move in lockstep. We have had success in the sanctions we've imposed for the occupation of Crimea, on senior Russian officials responsible for and orchestrating that and the violence in the south and east. We are working now on encouraging the European Union to match the sanctions that the U.S. has put in place on those closest to Putin and their organizations, because we do believe that those sanctions have had a serious impact on the Russian economy and, frankly, in destabilizing markets, which, as we both cited statistics, are the most impactful aspect. And as I said in my testimony, what will have the biggest impact is if we move to sectoral sanctions. The President, as Assistant Secretary Glazer has made clear, has given us an executive order that allows us to look at energy, banking, defense sector, mining. So we are now in intense consultations, including those that David Cohen and Ambassador Dan Fried are engaged in this week, on how those sectoral sanctions could work.
Well, thank you so much. As usual, I talked too much and I ran out of time, so we'll give you another opportunity. Maybe somebody will bring it up. And so pleased to yield to Mr. Meeks of New York for his question and answer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Secretary, Mr. Glazer. My first questions were somewhat on the same line as Ms. Ileana Ross-Layton, but for different reasons. I believe in sanctions when they're multilateral, not unilateral, because unilateral sanctions don't seem to work. We're not able to really accomplish what our goal is when it's just us by ourselves, and or what effects they have on our allies, who we work very closely with. And so I want to make sure that, because I'm very concerned about the aggression of Russia, and I want to make sure that we do certain things, but we're not isolating ourselves in the long run. So it's important to me that we are, in fact, working with NATO and others in the Baltic states and everything, because I know, for example, we met with some individuals from Latvia, for example, and they are saying it's important to have certain kinds of sanctions as opposed to others, because it could be devastating to them and their country and cause turmoil within their own ranks, and we'll end up hurting the very people that we want to help. So, with that being said, let me ask this question. Do you feel that we're having the level of cooperation from our NATO allies, et cetera, as they understand the same vision? Are we on the same playing field with the vision of how we've got to fight back the aggression that has been moved, as we see with Russia moving forward into the East Ukraine and Crimea?
Thanks, Congressman. I would say that in the rounds of sanctions we've done heretofore, we've moved largely in lockstep with Europe. There are some differences that have to do with the legal authorities, and we're seeking to close the gaps that exist, as I said, particularly with regard to those closest to Putin. But as we get to sectoral sanctions, it does get harder, and the principles that you outlined are the same ones that we have. Assistant Secretary Glazer can speak to it, but we want to have more of an impact on the Russian economy than we have on our own. We want to share the pain, if there is to be economic pain, across different sectors. That helps keep Europe together, but it also ensures that one sector of our economy isn't hit harder than another. We want to use a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. We want to talk primarily about forward investment opportunities.
And as you've testified, of course, always having the door open, because I'm also a firm believer in diplomatic solutions. I don't think really that a military solution, as some have hinted at, or giving of military equipment is the answer here. I think that we have to try to figure out a way to do it through joint sanctions, as well as with our NATO allies, and then try to hopefully that the Russians will end up coming to the diplomatic table, and we can resolve this crisis on a diplomatic basis. Because my next question would be, there are other serious issues that we still have to deal with Russia. Last week, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Anita Freed testified before this committee, and I asked her about U.S.-Russian cooperation still, because there's a lot of other things that we were doing with Russia. And she informed me that despite the ongoing crisis in the Ukraine, that U.S. is still cooperating with Russia on certain matters, such as nuclear arms agreements, that's still going. So I was wondering also, in regards to the Iran, dealing with Iran with the P5+1, could you tell us more specifically what is the status of our cooperation with Russia on other issues that are very important to us, for example, military cooperation and development, and economic and anti-piracy and so on, and dealing with Syria? Where are we with, are we still working in an accord in that regards?
Thank you, Congressman. We have, as you know, curtailed most of our bilateral economic work with Russia, most of our bilateral military to military. But on all of the global issues that you mentioned, whether it's Iran, Syria, the arms control commitments that we have to each other, we have largely maintained these conversations. We don't do that as a favor to Russia. Russia participates because it is in their interest to keep Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, et cetera. So those have largely continued.
And lastly, I've got 11 seconds, so I don't know if I'm going to get it in. I was wondering, do you think that the sanctions that are in place affecting at all our cooperation with Russia? Are they trying to push back, saying, oh, if you don't stop these sanctions, are they threatening us at all in that regards? They're threatening to stop cooperating on these international events?
Again, heretofore the assessment holds that Russia cooperates in these issues not as a favor to us either, but because they judge them to be in their interest, and that cooperation has continued.
Would the gentleman yield for 1 minute? One thing I did want to clarify, and that is, Mr. Meeks, I have never heard anyone argue for a military solution. And as a matter of fact, in our conversations with the President of Ukraine and the Prime Minister of Ukraine, both made clear to us that they didn't expect any U.S. military involvement. So I just did want to clarify that comment that you alluded to, because I just, in the Senate or House, haven't seen any member.
I just heard some of our colleagues say that we should be giving some arms to the Ukraine, or arming them in that regard, and so that tells me...
That was the second half of your statement, but the first part went to a military solution, as you were. I just wanted to clear the record on that. Let us go now to Mr. Chris Smith of New Jersey.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our two distinguished witnesses today for their work. I do have a couple of questions. The recent IRI poll suggested an overwhelming 84% of Ukrainian citizens said they will definitely or are likely to vote in the elections, including a substantial majority in the two regions in which the militants are very active. So that is a tremendous sign of ownership of their future. And I do have a couple of questions. As co-chair of the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, Ben Cardin and I will co-lead a delegation on the 25th of May to be election observers. And if any members here are interested, please see me, and perhaps you could join us in that effort. But I do have some questions about the Ukrainian preparations for the elections, your thoughts on how well they are progressing, a breakdown of what voters, where voters may be at risk, and what special precautions are being taken to ensure their safety, as well as the safety of and integrity of the ballot. I would also like to know, about the possibility of a runoff. We know in 2010, Yanukovych won against Tymoshenko, and of course, Yushchenko came in a very distant third, but it did trigger a runoff, and we didn't get the winner, and it was Yanukovych, and it was judged to be a free and a true election with some discrepancy, but largely free and fair. The 2012 elections had more problems on the parliamentary level, so I'm just wondering if enough safeguards are in place to ensure that this ballot, it is, even though there's 20 people running, it probably is a two-way race between Poroshenko and Tymoshenko, although it may be a single winner because she is trailing significantly in the teens right now. So I'm just wondering if, again, integrity of the ballot, people who vote, particularly in disputed areas, what precautions are being put into place to ensure their safety.
Thanks, Congressman, and we are enormously grateful that you're going to lead an election observer team with Senator Cardin, and we encourage anybody who has an interest to go, because the more observers, the better an election will have. First of all, just on what OSCE's findings are as of the middle of April, that the Central Election Commission has met all of its legal deadlines, that it's registered 23 candidates, that there is a sound framework for free media, that there are 35.9 million registered voters. They've all registered online. That election commissions have been formed in virtually every one of the 225 districts. There are 32,000 presidential precinct election commissions, all of them, with the exception of those in Crimea and some locations in Donetsk, notably Slavyansk, are fully on schedule to prepare for these elections, including with regard to preparation of lists and all of those things. Obviously, security leading up to the elections and on election day at polling places for election materials, et cetera, will be paramount. As I said, Secretary Kerry spoke to Prime Minister Yatsenyuk this morning. The Prime Minister made clear that they are focused like a laser on this, as they are on getting out the vote. They are also talking about, I think they are working with the OSCE now on alternative sites for Crimeans to exercise their right to vote if they choose, and for places like Slavyansk where it may be too violent to vote. But just to underscore where you started, the polling is indicating almost 70% of folks in the east of Ukraine are excited about casting their ballot. And that's the best guarantee of political stability in Ukraine.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Ambassador or Assistant Secretary Glazer, can you describe in more detail the sanctions that have been taken by our European allies? How effective do you think they've been in light of their financial and economic integration with Russia, particularly in the area of the energy sector?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to try to answer that question. The European Union so far has focused their targeting on specific individuals that have been involved with the violation of the sovereignty of Ukraine and the incursion into Crimea. That in combination, I think you can't really break out the impact of the European measures from the impact of the U.S. measures. I think you have to look at the situation in total. And when you look at the situation in total, again, Chairman Royce and I both rattled off some numbers as to what the impact has been to date in terms of impact on the Russian economy. I think equally as important as that, although not quite as quantifiable as that, has been the market uncertainty that it creates, the chilling effect on further business dealings with Russia, on further investments in Russia. And what that does is it sets a framework, it sort of sets the table for us all to collectively take more significant action. When Chancellor Merkel was here in Washington last week, she and President Obama made clear, as has Ambassador Nuland just now, that the next step in that would very likely be sanctions that target entities within sectors of the Russian economy. There's been a lot of discussion about the financial sector or the energy sector, things like that. That's precisely, and this gets to a question I was asked earlier, precisely what Undersecretary Cohen and Ambassador Fried are in Europe, in London, Paris, Berlin this week talking about, because I do think that U.S., even acting on our own, can exact costs on Russia. I think we've demonstrated that. But certainly given the economic, financial, energy integration between Russia and Europe, anything that we do is going to be so much more effective in a multilateral context, both from an actual financial economic point of view and certainly from a political messaging point of view. And what they're doing right now is sitting down with our European counterparts and going through concepts on how do we do this? How do we and Europe work together to have a very effective, targeted set of actions against sectors of the Russian economy that, as Ambassador Nuland articulated, maximize the impact of Russia on Russia while minimizing the impact on our own businesses and our own economies. We understand that there's going to be costs to these actions. We understand that. But if we do it in a smart, strategic way, we think we could have the impact that we're looking for, and I'm quite certain that the Russians understand that very well.
Thank you both.
Mr. Albio Series of New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here. You know, along the same line as my colleague from New Jersey, these sanctions, I would think that in order for them to really be effective, the people of Russia have to feel it. Do we have any evidence that the actual people, not just Putin's friends or the people in leadership, are impacted by this, but the actual Russian people? Because it seems that his numbers keep going up as more popular and more popular as he makes these moves.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly sometimes takes time for damage to an economy to reflect in opinion polls with respect to leadership, but it is certainly the case that Russia is feeling on a very, very broad level the impact of the measures we've taken. As we said, as recently as February, IMF was forecasting a 2% growth for Russia. That's for Russia. That's not for Putin's inner circle. That's for Russia. And now is forecasting near 0% and speculating that there might, in fact, be a recession. That's a recession for Russia as a whole. So I think that the Russian leadership has to understand that the health of the Russian economy is very much at stake with respect to the measures we've taken. And these are the initial measures that we've taken. As we've said, we are in very, very intense consultation and discussions with the Europeans on taking measures that would have an even greater impact on the Russian economy. And as I said, I think that even in and of itself has created a level of market uncertainty that is continuing to damage the Russian economy quite broadly.
Because it seems to me that these sanctions are directed at his friends, not necessarily the people of Russia. Is that accurate? I mean, the people are the ones that are going to speak and say, hey, let's stop this.
We've, as you know, sanctioned not only people in leadership, but also those close to Putin. But the effect has been general market uncertainty, which is affecting the whole economy. For example, the cost of borrowing inside Russia is going up and up and up. Inflation is going up and up and up. I was in Europe last week
So these are what people are feeling.
That people will begin to feel it. I was about to say that I was talking to a number of European business folks on a trip I took around allied capitals last week, including on sanctions. And business folks were reporting that the Europeans are not making new investments, that the cost of their products exported to Russia are going up because of inflation, that they're not getting the orders for luxury goods because Russians are biding their time and waiting to see what happens. So there's a lot of impact already. But our goal is not to hurt the Russian people per se. Our goal is to get Putin to change course.
Well, you know, obviously our goal is not to hurt the Russian people, but the Russian people are the ones that are going to speak to make sure that the leadership change the course that they have taken. Can you talk to me a little bit about this Russian baloney of federalization, that they want the proposed amendment to the Constitution? What is this federalization? What does it mean? What are they talking about?
Well, obviously, if I were still at the spokesperson's podium, I would refer you to Russia as to what they're talking about. But the original concept appeared to be such a broad decentralization of power that regions would have the right to independently vote to secede, attach themselves to Russia, et cetera, which obviously under nobody's constitution is the right way to go. What the Ukrainian government and what the Constitutional Reform Commission are offering, however, is very, very broad decentralization of authority and budgeting to local regions. Ukraine has been too centralized a state, and that's been part of the problem. But when Prime Minister Yatsenyuk was here, he gave a speech at the Atlantic Council in which he talked about devolving authority for everything except defense, foreign affairs, and some judicial functions to the regions. Keep their own tax money, administer themselves, education, language, as well as electing their own officials. So there is a really heavily decentralized future for Ukraine, but it needs to be achieved politically and not at the barrel of a gun.
Thank you very much.
We'll go now to Mr. Dana Rohrabacher of California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Newland, so what's the bottom line for the cost of all of this to the United States?
As I gave some numbers, I believe, in my opening with regard to FY 13-14, so we're at $187 million, which is about where we've been in support for Ukraine over the last 5 years. We've increased it by another $50 million, and then the loan guarantee.
But with all the election observers, that includes the election observers? And
that includes the U.S. participation in the OSCE election
so
observers.
it's $187 million.
$187 million plus 50.
Plus 50.
Which was appropriated on April 1st.
Okay.
$18 million from the defense budget for support for security services and border guards. But it's not that much more, with the exception of the $50 million, than what we've been spending in Ukraine over the years.
Have we signed on into something with World Bank, guaranteeing any loans, for example?
So, as you know, you've appropriated the, you've authorized the $1 billion loan guarantee, which scores at $400 million for the Treasury. With regard to the World Bank, they're just at the beginning of what they might be able to do to support. So I'm not aware of any new loans that they've executed. I think they're going to wait and see how the elections go.
Okay, so we've spent about $200 million, and we've got $400 million that we've scored for the guaranteeing of that loan.
Which will come back to the U.S. Treasury when the loan is paid back, as you know.
Right, when the loan is paid back.
With interest.
Right. Shall we all hold our breath for that? So do we have preferential payback then? Does that mean that all the other bills that the Ukrainian government owns, they're going to have to pay us that $400 million first?
Congressman, we'll have to get you the details on exactly what the terms of this are.
Yeah,
I think it's with the Treasury to do.
I think that we know what the answer to that is, but I'd be happy to get it officially. Let me ask you this. When we're talking about the election, the best observed election, Yanukovych, of course, was someone who was elected the last time. Very well-observed election, I might add. Matter of fact, Chris Smith was there observing that election, gave that election a very big plus. Yanukovych was elected, so he does represent a significant point of view in that country. Is there someone from his party who is going to be on the ballot?
In fact, his party, the Party of Regions, is fielding 4 of the 23 candidates who are registered. Communists are also there. Every single color of the political spectrum in Ukraine and every region is represented among the 23 candidates. So there's somebody for everybody to vote for.
So it's better, it's more than just the best observed election, it's a legitimate election.
That is what the OSCE assesses.
Right. Well, we did have an election, we did have a legitimate election before, and the elected president was removed after we had major street violence in reaction to his decision of going with an economic agreement with Russia rather than the EU. About that street violence that happened that led to this Mr. Yanukovych's removal, there were pictures that people running around with these that we were told were neo-Nazis. Were there neo-Nazis in those street violence that led to Mr. Yanukovych's removal?
First of all, the vast majority of those who participated on the Maidan were peaceful protesters. If you had a chance to see the pictures, many of us visited, including many members here. There were mothers and grandmothers and
Yeah.
veterans.
Let me
and
note
every-
that I have,
however,
before you go on, I saw those pictures as well. I also saw a lot of pictures of people throwing firebombs at groups of policemen who were huddled over in a corner, where people shooting into the ranks of police. So yes, there were mothers with flowers, but there were also very dangerous street fighters who were engaged in those demonstrations. The question is, were there neo-Nazi groups involved in that?
There were, as I said, almost every color of Ukraine was represented, including some ugly colors.
The answer is yes, then.
But if I could say that with regard to the violence, all of those incidents are subject to investigation, notably including the deadly sniper incident in February, and there is good evidence to believe that there were outside agitators involved in that.
Was there any indication that there were guns being involved with the anti-government demonstrators at that time?
There is no question that as the protests became more and more virulent, and as the response of Yanukovych's police became more and more brutal, the tensions and the potential for use of weapons escalated on both sides, which was why we were so intent on a political settlement in February.
One last question before my time is totally up, and that is, were there the neo-Nazi groups that we're talking about here, which, again, were not dominating this. There were very many very good people, like you say, out demonstrating against this deal with Russia. They wanted to go with more of a European country than a pro-Russian country. But those people who were not the good guys, but were part of that effort to push that country in that direction, were any of those neo-Nazi groups affiliated with any other Nazi groups in other countries?
Congressman, what I can tell you, I don't know what the answer to that specific question with regard to the early period is. What I can tell you is that in the violence and separatism that we have seen in the recent months, we've also seen recruiting on the neo-Nazi and fascist sites in Russia for volunteers to go participate in the seizing of buildings in eastern Ukraine, and the Ukrainians report stopping very large numbers of such people at the Ukrainian-Russian border.
Well, I'm sure, but you haven't seen any evidence that there are people in Western Europe, neo-Nazi groups, that were supporting their brothers in Ukraine.
I don't have any information to corroborate that, but I would refer you to the Ukrainians as they investigate these incidents of violence.
Thank you.
Brad, did you want to yield for the moment? Okay, we go now to Mr. Ted Deutsch
Thank you,
of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Sherman, for yielding. I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Engel, for your continued focus on the crisis in Ukraine. You've acted swiftly and with resolve since Russia's first provocations, and because of that, the world knows where this Congress stands. Ambassador Nuland, Assistant Secretary Glazer, as you're well familiar, there are many moving parts to this situation. Rightfully, the United States has been in the forefront taking aggressive economic action to dissuade the Russian government from any further meddling in the domestic events of another country, providing Ukraine with a loan guarantee and non-lethal military aid to bolster their ability to withstand subversive external pressure. And we're working closely with our European allies to create a unified front against Russian influence in Ukraine. We must sustain this pressure until we are sufficiently reassured and can verify that the Russian government will not continue to stir dissent within Ukraine's borders or threaten the territorial integrity of any of its neighbors. But I want to talk about the way we're working with our European allies to achieve that. Ambassador Nuland, you had said earlier that that sector-based sanctions may be something we consider if needed. Now, for all of us who have been so involved in Iran sanctions, it is the sector-based sanctions that we know are so effective. What I'd like you to do is explain one, what those sector-based sanctions will look like, and two, given that European trade with Russia is 10 times greater than that between the United States and Russia, what do we do to bring our European allies firmly on board, especially at a time when there are some in Europe, some former government officials who are deeply involved in the Russian economy? What do we do? What should that look like? When will it be necessary? And how do we ensure that we can go forward together with our European allies?
Thanks, Congressman, and I would invite Assistant Secretary Glazer, who's the sanctions expert, to jump in here. But as we develop this sectoral approach, the idea here is, as I said, to use a scalpel rather than a hammer, to focus primarily on high-tech and other investment where Russia needs us far more than we need Russia. I don't want to get into too much detail, but to say that the approach would also involve taking a sectoral slice across a bunch of different sectors at the same time, such that the pain is shared among sectors of the economy, and to help keep Europeans together, because different ones are vulnerable in different sectors. But we do think that we can be quite effective. I would note that whereas Russia trades 9% with, whereas Europe trades 9% with Russia, Russia's trade is 50% based in Europe. So they are far more vulnerable, and we do believe that they're particularly vulnerable in the area of the high-tech imports that they need to take their economy to the next stage. I don't know if Assistant Secretary Glazer wants to add.
Mr. Glazer.
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you for the question. You know, you and I have spoken many times about strategically applying targeted sanctions. So I don't think I'm telling you anything that you don't already know. If you look at the way we've applied targeted measures in the past in a strategic way, it has been pursuant to an escalation, which, as you say, in certain cases culminated in broad targeting of sectors. When that happened in the case of Iran, it happened well into the escalation and into the strategy, and then it also happened, if you'll recall, in that same summer, in the context of Europe taking significant action to target virtually every bank that the United States was targeting. And all that together is why it was so effective. Now, in this case, I understand that we're operating on a much more compressed time frame. There's much more urgency with respect to acting quickly on that, and that's why you see us taking similar sorts of measures on a similar sort of compressed time frame. We've started off by targeting individuals. We've targeted individuals which have significant holdings throughout the Russian financial and economic sector. I think we've already significantly weakened it. And now we're in conversations with our European colleagues on how to, in a very smart way, do exactly what you want us to do, which is target sectors more broadly.
I appreciate that. Just in my final seconds, I wanted to follow up on something that was in the New York Times on Monday. At the end of a report, it said that Ukrainian security forces stopped the transport of contraband uranium that originated in Transnistria. It's alarming that any amount of radioactive material would be in the hands of non-state actors, both for Ukraine's defenses and for regional security and stability. Can you comment on that report? We've not seen it widely reported. How concerned should we be? Where does this come from?
Well, it speaks to the lawlessness on borders and the fact that we are going to have to continue to help the Ukrainians going forward with border security. We are involved in supporting them in this incident.
All right. Thank you. And thank you. I'll yield back to Mr. Chairman. Thank you again, Mr. Sherman.
But I yield, Mr. Chapman.
Thank you. I appreciate the chairman yielding. Madam Ambassador, let me start out with, first of all, relative to Crimea, there seems to be often in the stories that we read and the attitude and the statements that are made relative to Crimea that it's more or less fait accompli now. It's occurred. Russia won. It's now been annexed. Crimea is now part of Russia, which I certainly don't share that attitude. And I'd like to hear what the administration has to say about that. It's almost like we're completely focused now on eastern Ukraine, and we have to make sure that Putin doesn't do the same thing there he did in Crimea, but Crimea is gone. And I'm very concerned about that attitude. Could you address that, please?
We're concerned too, Congressman. That's why in the most recent round of sanctions that we did, what was not the round a week ago, but 2 weeks ago, we deepened and broadened the sanctions on those who have taken up illegal posts in Crimea. We sanctioned all of the leaders of the illegal Crimean government. We also sanctioned a major gas entity that had been expropriated by Russia, and we're continuing to look at more targets in Crimea and more targets in Russia associated with Crimea, and we will do that. I would just take this opportunity to say that we are also gravely concerned about the deteriorating human rights situation inside Crimea, where there appears to be a mirroring of some of the practices that Russia exercises at home.
Thank you. I would just urge the administration in both their statements and their interactions with Russia especially, but with our allies and everybody else, not to fall into that trap where we just sort of, even without acknowledging that it's a fait accompli, that it sort of is, and therefore let's move on and try to keep them from going even further, because I do not think that we ought to consider Crimea to be an unalterable part of Russia at this point on. Let me move on. In your statement, you had quoted President Obama, his March 20th statement, which I'll quote again here. America's support for our NATO allies is unwavering. We are bound together by our profound Article 5 commitment to defend one another, and that's our NATO allies. Now, of course, Ukraine is not a member of NATO, and so I just want to make sure here, is that unwavering commitment of our support, or how wavering or unwavering is it for the Ukraine, since they're not a part of NATO, although the Clinton administration, of course, signed the Budapest Memorandum, which after Ukraine gave up their nukes, basically, you can interpret it different ways, but many would interpret it that the Brits and us and Russia more or less guaranteed or ensured the sovereignty of Ukraine, which has clearly been violated by Russia's actions here. Could you comment on just how unwavering our commitment to Ukraine is?
Thanks, Congressman. The President's statement referred to our solemn treaty commitment ratified by the Senate to mutual defense of NATO allies. As you know, Ukraine is not a member of NATO and therefore is not covered by the U.S. security guarantee. That said, we have had a long and deep 20-year security relationship with Ukraine, and this Congress has authorized significant support for our military-to-military relationship, including helping Ukraine deploy with us to Afghanistan, to Kosovo. We believe that some of the support we've given to the Ukrainian military over the years, including military education, contributed to their refusal to fire on their own people when Yanukovych wanted them to. And then, as you know, in recent months, we've contributed $18 million in non-lethal assistance to Ukrainian security forces and to the border guards. As we mentioned, border defense, absolutely essential to keeping separatists and thugs out of Ukraine.
Thank you. I've only got about 30 seconds left, so I'll be real quick on this final question. What's the administration and our allies doing to counter the Russian propaganda in Ukraine? And what's being done by the West and by the U.S. in particular to assist Ukraine in dispersing the truth out there, particularly prior to an election? We obviously don't want to get involved in who wins, but what are we doing to get the truth out there?
We have a very sizable public diplomacy program in Ukraine. We also have mounted in the last couple of months under Secretary for Public Diplomacy Rick Stengel's authority and all of government effort to counteract Putin's lies. It includes our United for Ukraine Twitter campaign, which now has totally outstripped government. Only 5% of the content is government. It's 95% now a public conversation. We put out a regular product twice a week to all of our embassies, to all of our contacts in the media around the world, and particularly in Europe, counteracting falsehoods and putting out truths. We have recently increased the support we give to the Ukrainian government for its own media center. But as we talked about at the beginning of the hearing, among the difficulties we face is this massive Russian propaganda campaign that includes separatists dismantling TV towers in the east of Ukraine to ensure that only Russian programming gets through, but also that there are no journalistic standards, including a standard of truth in what's being pumped out. So it is very important, and we are very grateful that you are continuing to look at how to get us back to the kinds of tools that we used to have for this kind of an effort.
Thank you. Yield back.
Yes, Mr. Brad Sherman.
One of the thorniest issues in foreign policy is self-determination versus territorial integrity. We've supported the independence of South Sudan and accepted the independence of Eritrea. In Europe, we supported the independence of each of the republics of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. We supported the independence of each of the republics of the Federation of Yugoslavia. We created the independence of Kosovo. On the other hand, we oppose the independence of northern Kosovo. We oppose the independence of the Krajina region of Croatia, which was inhabited by Serbs. We oppose the independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and we, of course, oppose the independence or any other action with Crimea. Seems kind of haphazard. In Moscow, they note that although I've identified like 30 different decisions we've had to make in Europe that seem haphazard, every single one of those decisions is the anti-Moscow decision. What are our policies? When are we in favor of territorial integrity? When are we in favor of self-determination? When are we cheering on the people of South Sudan or Croatia? When are we oppose it? Why do we oppose the independence of northern Kosovo? Is it haphazard, Ambassador?
Congressman, thanks for the opportunity to remind that in keeping with the UN Charter, the United States and our European allies and most civilized nations on the planet oppose the changing of borders by force. And that's what happened in Crimea, or that was the effort in Crimea. With regard to Kosovo...
Are you saying that northern Kosovo is not, the Kosovo wasn't forced, South Sudan wasn't forced?
Kosovo was first and foremost a victim of a
a
marauding military operation of ethnic cleansing by Milosevic, which, as you know, the international community spent more than a decade trying to pacify.
Well, there was
and
certainly
the decision on
force
independence was the
in
result of a referendum of the people.
The independence of several of the Yugoslav republics was achieved by force. There are many. It's not like every time we've supported independence, it was some clean, bloodless operation. But I'll agree with you. The people of Kosovo had survived some terrible onslaughts that caused for change. Let me shift to another issue. Has the right sector militia been disarmed, and has Kiev tried very hard to disarm them?
The government of Ukraine has made a massive effort to disarm the Pravi sector, to lock up those leaders who have been found to use violence. They are also putting them on trial. They've also offered a weapons buyback program, and they're working very intensively.
How successful has that effort been?
They have made significant progress, and there's more progress to make.
The language law of 2012 in the Ukraine gave special treatment or security to those who speak Russian. There was an attempt to repeal that law. I believe that repeal was vetoed. Have the leaders of the Ukraine committed to their own people or committed to the world that they are willing to keep that law in force? Or are we in the United States in a situation where we may suffer costs and disruption and danger because Kiev wants to repeal a language law?
Well, as you said, Congressman, that effort to repeal the law was vetoed by Acting President Turchinov. The Ukrainian Constitutional Commission and the current government have made broad statements to the effect that language rights will be protected in the constitutional reform process. You know that Ukraine currently has one of the most liberal language regimes in the world, where if you have 10% local population, they can study, they can have local services in their local language. So the expectation is that that will be continued, but it's a matter for the Ukrainian people to decide in the constitutional reform process.
Squeeze in one more question. Some have proposed that we export natural gas to the Ukraine. The Ukrainians can't afford to buy that natural gas for $10 a unit from Russia. The Japanese bid $15 or $16 per unit for natural gas that they purchase on the world market, which means anybody exporting natural gas from the United States would sell it for the world market price. Do you know of a pot of money that would allow us to subsidize Ukrainian natural gas purchases that came from us and from our private companies? Do you got tens of billions of dollars lying around to do that?
Congressman, it's not actually going to go that way. What we're working on to help Ukraine with its energy independence are a number of things. The fastest short-term step is to help with reverse flows of gas from the European market into Ukraine. We've worked intensively with the EU, with Slovakia, with Ukraine to get that reverse flow going. It's also coming now from Poland, from Hungary. But over the longer term, it goes to Ukraine's own resources,
Ambassador, you haven't,
fracking.
here in Congress, we're all talking about exporting U.S. gas to the Ukraine. So that was the question, but we'll have to go on to someone else.
Thank you very much. Next, we have Judge Poe.
Thank the Chairman. Thank you for being here. I share my friend's frustration with U.S. foreign policy, because even though I thought he asked the question very well about when do we support self-determination and when do we support a current government, sorry, I didn't get an answer. I don't know what our policy is. It seems to me like decision is made at the time, and I'm not sure whose interest it's made in. It seems to me that the Russians, and I was in Ukraine with some other members of Congress and saw firsthand the people at Maidan, and also saw the memorial to all that were killed by the old government, the civilians, that the Russians believe in creating a crisis in somebody else's country, unrest, political unrest, and then the Russians want to go in militarily or some other way and solve the unrest. It seems like they did that in Georgia. The world got all upset about the Russian taking 1/3 of the Georgian country, but the Russian tanks are still there. I saw them not too long ago. And now they went into Crimea. The world said that's not nice, and they're still there. It looks to me like they're moving into the eastern part of Ukraine. I think we have a map, if we can show this, and members also have their own personal copy. If we can put this map up, let me just know when you're ready, of what the Russian troops look like on the Ukrainian border. It's a little scary if you live on that side of the Ukraine. And I met with other countries, Moldovan parliament yesterday. They all wanted to talk about, we're next. We think the Russians are taking us next. And other countries are very concerned about the Russian mode of operation is to cause a crisis, go in, solve the crisis, intimidate countries, and I think that's what they want to do with Ukraine, intimidate them into ceding some of that land, but we shall see. Is the purpose of the sanctions, American sanctions, to stop the Russians where they are, or is the purpose of the American sanctions to say, you not only can't go any further, you got to give Crimea back? Which of those two? It's got to be one or the other.
The latter, Congressman.
So we want them out of Crimea.
We do not recognize their occupation of Crimea, and they need to roll back, and they need to get their 40,000 troops off Ukraine's borders as well. I've talked, as you just did, about the arsonist setting the fire and then coming in dressed as the fireman, and then occupying the building.
And the Russian special forces going into Georgia dressed like Georgians, if you will, and then they come into Crimea and now in Eastern Europe and they cause the hostilities. They're Russian special forces causing these disturbances, according to some reports. Do you believe those reports, Ambassador?
We have high confidence, I can say, in a setting like this, of Russian involvement in planning, financing, organizing of these efforts to destabilize eastern Ukraine, including the presence of Russian agents.
The I would say that the purpose of sanctions, I don't think have worked. In all fairness, I don't think they've stopped Russians from doing anything. But if we impose further sanctions, I hope we're careful that we don't punish American companies. We punish, if we're punishing somebody, we punish Russian economy, if you will, and careful about what we do to American companies. I think, as far as sanctions go, I think, to coin a phrase, proof is in the Putin. And in this case, it didn't seem to stop him at all in what he wants to do. Here's a map. You have, I think, a small one there in front of you. I hope somebody gave you the small one. If you can't see it, then we'll come back to it before my 5 minutes is up. Supply the witnesses with a smaller map. It's not a trick question. I just want you to look at it and see if you agree with this might be the Russian mode of operation and where the Russians are on the eastern Ukraine. Does the United States, Georgia, I want to go back to Georgia, their security operation, they want to be in NATO. Does the United States on the upcoming NATO conference, do we support offering Georgia a map? We support that.
We have long believed that Georgia has met the criteria for MAP. The concern is that we have to have 28 votes in the alliance in order to grant them MAP, and we don't have them at the moment.
Okay. I do believe we ought to help Europe economically, and it's one way we need to, we can help this crisis is if we give the Europeans, not just Ukraine, but Europeans an alternative to Gazprom. I was in Ukraine when the Russians turned the gas off. It was cold, it was dark. They need an alternative. We've got abundance of both natural gas and crude oil. I would hope the administration would expedite the sale to Europe of those products to give competition to ease the tensions in the area. I'm almost out of time. If I could ask one more question, Mr. Chairman, that the map that I just showed you, if I were Ukrainian, I'd be a little nervous about all the Russian movement from Russia up to the border. Do you think that's a fair analysis of what the Russians have done toward Ukraine? Either one or both of you. That'd be my last question.
We do believe that this deployment of troops ringing Ukraine's border is designed to be intimidational, yes.
And they're still there?
They are. They've been on high alert for some 3 months. It must be extremely expensive.
All right, thank you both. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. The Chair will now recognize Mr. Keating from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You mentioned briefly about the human rights issues in Crimea, and I'm concerned particularly with the Tatar population that's there. In response to peaceful protests, Russian authorities have reportedly beaten some Tatar leaders, forced others into exile. Russian authorities have also threatened to shut down Tatar community's parliament. What's your assessment, particularly to the Tatar population in Crimea, and do you expect any tensions in that regard to even grow when we get around to May 18th and the 70th anniversary of the Soviet Union's forced deportation of Crimean Tatars?
Congressman, we are extremely concerned about the human rights situation for all Crimeans, but notably for Tatars. I think you know what we know, which is first and foremost that the Crimean Tatar leader himself, Mustafa Dzhemilev, has been banned from Crimea until 2019. We had a Euro-Maidan Crimean activist abducted in Severopol and tortured. We've had more than 7,000 IDPs come out of Crimea in this period. The local Crimeans are being told that they have to vacate their property, give up their land, and as you say, the 70th anniversary is coming. So our grave concern is that Russia is cloning its local human rights practices in Crimea now.
Good. There's one thing I think that's important to underscore to those from the outside looking at today's hearing, and that's the fact that when we're talking about our actions and we're talking about diplomatic solutions, it's important to really underscore the fact that this isn't about Russia and the United States determining the future of Ukraine, but the Ukrainian people themselves What can we do to continue to get that message across to the rest of the world? You've made it clear, I think, here to us that that's important, but I think it's an important message to underscore.
Absolutely, Congressman, and that speaks first and foremost to ensuring that this election on May 25th, where every eligible Ukrainian voter, north, south, east, or west, gets a chance to express their will about their future from a slate of 23 candidates, takes place. But it also speaks to the great care that we're taking in our diplomatic conversations with Europe, with Russia, with the OSCE. Nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. They must be part of all of this.
Great, an important point. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, gentleman yields to...
I thank the gentleman, and welcome to both of you. Mr. Glazer, you particularly enumerated, as did Ambassador Nuland, the economic consequences to Russia, and they're growing. To what extent do we believe that Putin is feeling that pressure from his own business community and is cognizant of the macroeconomic consequences that can ensue, even absent sanctions, just because of their behavior, his own behavior?
Congressman, one of the parlor games that I've found it unlucky to play is to try to get inside the head of President Putin and speculate as to what he knows, but the facts and the economic statistics are, could only smack any sane person in the head. So,
do you think he calculated that and made a calculated risk when he did what he did in Crimea nonetheless? I mean, you just said sane person. Certainly you don't think Mr. Putin is something other than sane, do you?
I didn't mean to make any calculation with regard to his mental state, but I do believe that...
You want to speculate?
But I do believe that the degree to which the Russian economy is integrated now into the global economy, which is a different situation than the one that he grew up with, causes vulnerabilities that may not be well understood by folks who don't work in the business sector day in and day out.
Yes. And let me just ask one more question real quickly. I want to go back to the whole question of our European allies. There have been some, both in the media and here in Congress, who kind of look at our State Department approach on possible sanctions, coordinated sanctions, as a bit of a feckless enterprise, given the reluctance of the Europeans, frankly, to do anything tough. And perhaps we haven't been all that tough on them to get tough. I wonder if you'd comment on that.
I'm happy to try to take that question, Congressman. I think that we have been quite tough to date, and I think that things are only going to get tougher and tougher for the Russians if the situation continues to escalate. I think the President has made that quite clear.
Mr. Glazer, the question, though, was how tough are the Europeans willing to be, and how tough are we being on them to be so?
Well, I think last week President Obama and Chairman Merkel Chancellor Merkel stood up together and made quite clear that if the May 25th elections were disrupted, then the United States and Europe were going to take significant actions. And President Obama made quite clear that that very well could include sectoral sanctions. And on the heels of that, we have a very senior group, Under Secretary Cohen, Ambassador Fried in Europe right now, working with Europeans to determine exactly what that would be. So Europe works sometimes on a different processes than we have. We have certain advantages in the way our sanctions program works that allows us to be a bit faster, and sometimes we're a bit stronger, and I don't think we should be shy about that. The key is that we're both moving in the same direction, creating the market uncertainties, and I think we're doing that, and I very much hope that when that if things don't go as we want them to go with respect to the elections, we're going to be prepared to take very, very significant measures that will have significant impacts on the Russian economy, and that would include the Europeans as well.
I would just add that in every single diplomatic conversation with between any European and any American at any level over the last 6 weeks, the issue of sanctions has been topic 1, 2, and 3, along with our efforts to work with Europe to de-escalate the conflict.
We're going to go to Mr. Ron
DeSantis
from Florida.
Yielding.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Nuland, does the administration assess that the actions of Russia may require us to relook at our force posture in Europe and our requirements for future deployments, exercises, and training in the region?
Congressman, I would say that the NATO reassurance mission that you're seeing begin to deploy out, and which I spoke about at the beginning, already constitutes a change in the way we're postured, that reassurance and Article 5 have come back to the forefront of the alliance's business. With regard to the medium and the long term, I think it depends on what we see from Russia and whether we're able to de-escalate this. As you know, the current mission, which has land, air, and sea reassurance and visible exercising, goes through the end of 2014. When we have our NATO summit in Wales in September, we will evaluate just the question that you have, whether things, more needs to be done and where and how.
So at this time, there's no either commitment or plan to have a presence on a more permanent basis in some of the region?
I think that we are open to doing what is necessary as we see this situation evolve, but I would simply say that it has already caused the Pentagon to look at plans that it had about how to posture globally, and they're working on that now.
And some of our allies, our NATO allies like Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, what have they, if anything, asked of us in this regard?
We have fulfilled, the U.S. has fulfilled all of the asks that we've had, which were primarily for increased air policing and for ground troops. As I said at the outset, we have 750 U.S. troops now, including deployments in all of the Baltic states, and that's been very reassuring. They've also wanted the high-level visits that they've had from members of Congress, from the Vice President, from others. We will continue to look at what more might be appropriate. As you know, we opened a new base in Estonia, or we supported use of an Estonian base for NATO missions, so we'll keep looking at that.
Now, in light of what's happened with Ukraine, Putin has taken this position that, well, look, a lot of these people are Russians. I'm actually saving them by violating Ukrainian sovereignty, and that same argument could obviously be applied to Latvia, Estonia, and some of our NATO allies because they have ethnic Russian populations. And so if that kind of pretext were used in some place like Latvia, the administration's position would be that Article 5 of NATO would clearly be invoked?
Absolutely. We have a solemn treaty commitment to our NATO allies.
And how do you, and maybe this is just news reports, but there have been some reports coming out of Latvia of, even though we've assured them that we stand shoulder to shoulder, there's a lot of fear about what would happen and whether we would be willing, if push came to shove, to actually stand with them. So I'm wondering, is that something that you've received from folks in Latvia, or is that kind of the press puffing this up?
No, they are very concerned. They are now frontline states, a word I never wanted to use again in my career, but we have to use now. So that is why the physical reassurance of having American ground troops, having American planes in the air, and now working with other allies to also join us in the Baltic states, in Poland, in Romania, in Bulgaria is so important.
So, but is the fear, of course there's fear about what Russia may do, but is that fear amplified because of perhaps not knowing what we may do, or do you think that they're satisfied that we would be there to support them?
Again, I think the reassurance mission and the arrival, particularly of ground troops, has gone a long way towards making it clear that we intend to honor our commitments, but we have to continue to talk to them and evaluate what they need.
Thank you for that, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. We go now to Mr. David Cicilline of Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for this hearing and also for leading our delegation recently to Ukraine. I thank Ambassador Nuland and Secretary Glazer for being here. I think it's very clear, and I hope this hearing reinforces the notion that there are tremendous consequences, obviously, for the Ukrainian people for what is currently happening there, but also for the region and ultimately the significant geopolitical consequences for the world and including the national security of our own country. So I think our assessment is the same as yours, that there was significant evidence of Russia's involvement in planning, organizing, and inciting events inside of Ukraine. And we were also, I think, struck by the overwhelming Ukrainian support for a unified democratic country, and that includes in Crimea. And I think, to build on the question earlier about our ability to kind of support a response to this incredibly sophisticated, incredibly well-financed Russian propaganda machine that includes taking over television stations and denying access to Ukrainian television, so they're receiving all their information from Russian television. And I was very happy to hear the efforts that you described and whatever else you think we can do in the Congress to support that. I think it's critical. I know it's an important issue the chairman raised, but we saw lots of evidence of that. Second thing I want to mention is there was a recent report in the Sunday New York Times that began to reveal some of the kind of wealth that President Putin has accumulated and questioned some of the ways in which that has happened. And it would be useful, I think, for the world to understand more about that, and to the extent that the State Department and others can share that information. I think the Russian people have a right to know that. Certainly the Ukrainian people have a right to know that. But I want to ask you about specifically, Ambassador Nuland, is the NATO and European response. While your fourth pillar spoke about the importance of kind of reassuring our NATO allies, and obviously that's critical, but I also hope it's an opportunity for our NATO partners to re-examine their own commitments to NATO and to sort of understand that they have maybe, in almost every instance, but I think 4 countries, not met the requirements. And while this is of grave concern to us because of the geopolitical implications, it's on the front door of many of our European allies. And so I'd like you to speak to that. Do they understand that? Are they beginning to use this as an opportunity to kind of reawaken the importance of NATO and recommit to its role? And then secondly, if you would just speak to the human rights violations in Crimea to the extent that you can, I think we should know as much about that as we can. And I want to also mention, before I forget, to thank you for your staff that were a part of accommodating our visit. It was a very productive visit, and the embassy staff there was outstanding.
Thank you, Congressman. We are very proud of our embassy in Kyiv, led by Ambassador Pyatt. First, with regard to the new reality that NATO cannot simply be an exporter of security beyond its space, as we had been focusing on throughout the past 20 years, but that Article 5 is back as an area of primary focus for the alliance. I think it has been a wake-up call for all of us. And if, as you saw when the President was in Europe in March, and I think you'll see when he goes back to Europe in June, he is availing himself of every opportunity he has with European leaders to say it's time now to reverse the slide in European defense spending. Certainly raised that with Chancellor Merkel. He'll raise it with everybody else. And we are looking for each ally to do their part going forward. And frankly, this reassurance mission is not cheap either, so people are having to find budget and find capability. With regard to the human rights abuses in Crimea, I don't know if you were in the room when I answered Congressman Keating's question, but I went through some of what we're seeing. First and foremost, the Crimean leader himself being blocked from returning to Crimea till 2019, 7,200 IDPs, mostly Crimean Tatars, having fled from the Crimean Peninsula. Concerns that local authorities have now announced the Crimean Tatars are going to have to vacate their property, give up their land, particularly if they refuse to take Russian citizenship. Very, very concerned now that the human rights standards of Russia have migrated to Crimea.
And just if I could ask one final question, I think the chairman mentioned this. From everyone that we spoke to, they all see the presidential elections on May 25th as a very important turning point, and all of the efforts of the Russians and particularly President Putin to destabilize Ukraine, to try to prevent those elections from happening as a key strategy of the sort of aggression plan. Are there additional things we can be doing or encouraging our European partners to do to make sure those elections happen and that they're free and fair, and that the Ukrainian people get to decide who their democratically elected president will be?
Well, as we've been saying, you're absolutely right. This is the opportunity. If you really care what the people of the East think, let them vote, and let them vote for one of these 23 candidates. Let them express themselves politically. So this speaks to 2 pieces of the strategy. One is all the effort that we and the Europeans are putting into the strongest possible OSCE ODIHR monitoring mission in the transatlantic space ever, and the $11 million the U.S. has given to help ensure free, fair election and training The second piece is what we're talking about in terms of the President's press conference with Chancellor Merkel, where he said efforts by Russia to destabilize or prevent these elections from happening will result in sectoral sanctions. That's why we're working so hard now to prepare these sanctions so that that stick is visible and is real and is well understood, because we all have to let the Ukrainian people have their say.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. We now go to Mr. Ted Yoho of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for being here. I want to touch on Crimea again because you were talking about it and was one of my questions, and you answered most of it, is what is the atmosphere and environment of the pro-Russian people in Crimea? You just answered about the human rights violations. What are you seeing over there? Are they on edge? Do you see the country stabilizing? It doesn't sound like it. And are they accepting the separation?
You're talking about how do ethnic Russians in Crimea feel about what's happened?
Yes, ma'am.
I don't think it's a secret that they are not sad about what's happening, but there is a great amount of instability and lack of confidence in what comes next, including whether they're going to get the enormous investment that Russia's promised in their economy.
All right. Are you seeing a functioning government there with the people they've elected?
Frankly, I'm going to take that one because I haven't looked at it very carefully.
Okay. I want to ask you both about the billion-dollar loan guarantee that we voted here on, which I voted against, but I didn't get it recorded. Have we given guaranteed loan guarantees to the Ukraine before?
It's conceivable that we did a facility similar to this in the 90s. We'll have to check.
Okay, I'm going to submit that, and I'd like to an answer on that. And the reason I bring that up is after that vote, we had somebody come visit our office, and they thanked me for my vote, and I told him I voted against it. And he goes, I know you did, but we realize that's a gift to the Ukrainian people that we'll never pay back. And that kind of bothered me, and I shared that with some other congressmen, and they said they had no idea of that. So I want to check into that. If we're going to help out a country, I would like to get the money back, especially in these tough economic times. You had also brought up working with Russia in Syria and the work that we have with them. You see that going forward with the destruction of the chemical weapons. It seems like we've done a pretty good job on getting most of those. Do you see that continuing and Russia working with us on that?
Well, as you know, our cooperation with Russia on Syria has been mixed, but in the area of chemical weapons, we've largely worked fine together. We have now pulled, I think it's 92% of the chemical weapons out. We have a final 8%. Secretary Kerry, as you know, has had probably 3 phone calls with Foreign Minister Lavrov over the last 2 to 3 weeks to try to concert U.S. and Russian efforts.
I just want to make sure that was going that way, and I hope that continues. And what about future space flights and returning our astronauts? Because that one person said that we can use a trampoline. And, you know, those kind of working relationships, do you see those continuing?
That aspect of our space relationship is expected to continue, yes.
All right, and then
because it benefits both Russia and the United States.
Okay, and then you were talking about helping the Ukraine secure their borders and the amount of money that we've given them. I think you said $187 million plus $50 million plus another $18 million. And you said, had alluded that we had given them approximately $750 million over the last 5 years. You said roughly $150 to $180 million a year. Yet the reports I've read is that the Ukrainian government was wrought with corruption. There were human rights abuses, and I even heard reports of human trafficking. If they had a functioning government now to go in there now, what is going to make the dynamics different that they're going to secure the border and do those things that we wish them to do with the money that we're lending them, or giving them, not lending, giving hardworking American taxpayers money?
Right. The vast majority of money we've given to Ukraine over these years has not gone to the government. It's gone to support independent efforts and to support the NGO sector and to support Chernobyl and those kinds of things. But going forward, among the things that the transitional government has already gotten through is the first real anti-corruption legislation that we've seen in Ukraine through all of these years. So as part of the IMF program preparation, they supported broad public procurement transparency legislation, changes in the way energy is dealt with, the agricultural sector, a lot of these sectors that have been rife with corruption. Now, granted, these are setting a legislative bar and they now have to be implemented, but it was precisely fighting corruption that was one of the main motivators for the Maidan movement in the first place. So the expectation is that there will have to be, whoever is elected, broad implementation now to clean up Ukraine.
Thank you for your answers. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Poe. We now go to Dr. Ami Bera of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ambassador Newland and Mr. Glazer. You touched on the propaganda machine that's coming out of Russia and Moscow and the control of media and information, which, if we look back at history, is critical, and particularly history in this part of Eastern Europe, going back to World War II, going back to the Cold War. One mechanism to control the masses and one mechanism to get people fighting against each other is that propaganda machine and that control of the free flow of information. I was glad to hear that we are helping the Ukrainian people use social media. The Twitter account was United Ukraine, the hashtag. So what are some other mechanisms that we're doing to help the Ukrainian people, empower them, and get access to credible information?
Well, as you mentioned a couple of them, so putting forward our own positive information, helping them to get information translated, not just in Ukrainian, but in Russian, now to counteract all of this. We're supporting the government's media center so that they can get positive decisions on decentralization and constitutional reform out in Russian, in Ukrainian, in English as quickly as possible. We are also supporting independent media and particularly digital media because that's harder to take down. We support digital media in Russia and in Ukraine, and it was very effective during the Maidan period in getting instant communications. But as I said at the beginning, it's very, very difficult in an environment where Russia's taking down the infrastructure.
Right. And so, and a lot of that infrastructure may not have existed in the first place, but in terms of cell phone capabilities and so forth and using handheld devices, have they taken that infrastructure down as well?
Well, it's primarily the TV capacity, which is where the vast majority of Eastern Ukrainians get their news. So that's been the problem. But the government, in its operations to liberate entities, has put a priority on liberating TV towers, and they did get 2 back just in the last week. But as you know, when truth is optional, it's difficult. So our truth and their truth is what we need to get out.
So we certainly, under Chairman Royce's leadership, are very supportive of increasing our ability, Radio Free Europe and other capabilities to get information out and so forth. The other thing that I find disturbing, a month ago, again on this trend of propaganda and turning people against each other, I found the anti-Semitic flyers that were distributed incredibly reprehensible and very worrisome, given the history. Some of the worst tragedies of the Holocaust occurred in Ukraine, and to really look at some of these flyers, and they very much are reminiscent, asking members of a large and vibrant Ukrainian Jewish community to register or face deportation, just rings of some trends that are worrisome. I'm glad that the administration and Secretary Kerry came out very strongly against these. And while we don't know where they came from, it is actions like that I find worrisome. Have we seen other trends against not just the Ukrainian Jewish population, but many folks in my community fled Russia, fled Ukraine in search of religious freedoms and settled in the Sacramento area? Are we seeing other forms of propaganda or hate?
We are, not just in Crimea against all minority communities. I can give you some things here. On April 22nd, the Holocaust Memorial in Sevastopol was sprayed with a red hammer and sickle on the Slavyansk TV tower that was taken over, began broadcasting anti-Semitic programming. We've had Roma fleeing, particularly from Slavyansk, but other parts of eastern Ukraine, under threats of intimidation. There have been death threats against the chief rabbi of Crimea, who is now fled. Pro-Russian thugs kidnapped priests of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church in Crimea, interrogated them. So it is bad. It is bad.
So just in the few remaining moments, given the history and some of the tragedy and atrocities that have taken place in Ukraine during the Holocaust, we have to be very vigilant and standing with us. And I think on behalf of this entire body, we find those acts reprehensible and unacceptable.
As do we.
We go now to Mr. Adam Kinzinger of Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for being here and for serving your country in such a capacity. I apologize I was not here for most of the hearing, so I hope I don't touch on questions that were already asked. I want to stress a very important thing that I think gets lost in this, and that is my concern of this idea that we're not hearing much of a discussion about Crimea anymore, and it's almost a feeling that Crimea is just going to go to Russia. And I understand the difficulties that we're dealing with and the nature of this whole situation, but I would just remind everybody about the situation in Ukraine that an agreement was signed by these countries to respect the territorial integrity of a country that is now being torn apart by a nation like Russia. And this is something that's very concerning to me, as I know it's very concerning to you all. I'd like to stress what was said earlier about the support for Radio Free Europe. I think that's also very important, and I hope in Congress we consider that when we're dealing with our budget priorities. I also would like to mention just the issue of Georgia and what's been going on there, and put a plug in for NATO enlargement. I think when we deal with the membership action plan for Georgia as NATO comes together, I hope they'll consider putting Georgia in that. I don't think Georgia is asking for Article 5 protection, but at least to get them on the track of understanding that America stands with its friends. What I'd like to actually really touch on, and hopefully I won't take all 5 minutes, in 2011, France agreed to sell Russia 2 amphibious assault warships. It's a deal worth about $1.5 billion. In fact, the Russians said that they needed this capacity because, quote, or I guess kind of quote, in the war in Georgia, they were unable to control the Black Sea like they really wanted to. So they signed this deal with the French to buy these ships called the Mistrals, and it's the first ever sale of a significant offensive military capability by a NATO member to Russia. The first of these ships is scheduled to be delivered at the end of this year. In fact, I believe that Russian Marines are going to be coming to France to, in fact, train on these in the middle of this time, which is actually kind of shocking to me. In light of the U.S. decision to suspend exports that could strengthen the Russian military, does the U.S. believe that France should or will proceed with the delivery of these assault ships?
Congressman, we have regularly and consistently expressed our concerns about this sale even before we had the latest Russian actions, and we will continue to do so.
Okay. I think it's important just to mention on that again, at a time when we're looking at what's happening, I would hope the French, I understand the economic pressure, and I'm not here to bash the French, but I think this is a time where the French could stop that sale from happening and send a very strong message to the Russians. And in fact, I intend to pursue this issue and continue to bring it to the attention of the American people, the administration, everything else. So thank you for your support on that. Mr. Chairman, I don't have a whole lot else. I'm sure many of the issues were touched, so I'd like to yield back the remaining 2 minutes.
We thank the gentleman from Illinois, and we go to Lois Frankel of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I was very honored to travel with you to Ukraine a couple weeks ago. And I want to thank the staff for its great work, and also our State Department that helped us over there. First, I just want to answer we heard some comments from some of our colleagues that somehow we forced Mr. Yanukovych out. I'll tell you what we learned. He was very corrupt. This is a man who lied, cheated, and stole from his people and really undermined his government. And I think That's one of the reasons I'm so happy that we've been trying to address this corruption, because that does undermine the confidence of people and sets the stage for a bully like Putin to just to move in. I actually, after visiting and really trying to study this, I feel I'm very appreciative of the position that our president has taken and our administration, the moving carefully with economic sanctions, because knowing how our European allies, how their economy is so interwoven with Russia, and also dealing with these elections that are coming up, having fair and free elections, continuing to deal with the ethics and transparency, the corruption in Ukraine's government, and also trying to help them towards some type of energy efficiency. With all that said, here's what I think is missing. And I know we've had some discussion here today about why we are involved with Ukraine, why this should matter. I believe it matters after being there and after studying this. And I think one of our colleagues talked about the assurances we gave to Ukraine when they gave up a nuclear arsenal, that they would keep their territorial integrity. There's some other things that go with it, too. The nervousness of our NATO allies, what would happen if you had a failed state, and so forth. But I'd like to hear from you, and I think the American public really needs to hear from our administration why it is that what's going on in Ukraine, why the Russian aggression is something that we should care about. That's question number one. And secondly, I think it would also be important, and I'd like you to give an opportunity to articulate to the American public why it is that we have not just unilaterally tried to go in with sanctions, why it's so important to be respectful to what our European allies, what their concerns are in this matter. And so I'd like to, if you could address those 2 points.
Well, apart from our longtime support for democratic peoples and governments and the right of free choice of citizens, this goes to the core of the rules of the road of the global world order, that you can't simply chop off a piece of another country by force and get away with it. And this has been how conflicts start the world around. So it's about maintaining rule of law, maintaining democratic choice for people who want it and have struggled for it and are willing to sacrifice for it, not simply in Ukraine. But it's also about a very important piece of our 20-year project of a Europe whole, free, and at peace. And if Ukraine loses the opportunity to live freely, then the borders of the free world in Europe shrink and the borders of opportunity in Europe shrink. And that's difficult for us and it's difficult for our allies. With regard to unilateral sanctions, we're always stronger when we work together, because then you are sanctioning these entities not simply from the U.S. market, but from the European market as well. And Russia depends 50% on the European market for all of its trade. So if we don't do things together, then not only are you blocking U.S. business from access to a market, you're potentially having U.S. businesses' holes backfilled by others, so that's both ineffective and unfair. But on the whole, it's a matter of speaking with one voice about these rules of the road being inviolable.
If I could just add to that answer on sanctions, I also think it's important to emphasize the U.S. has acted unilaterally, and we're always prepared to act under our own authorities when we feel we need to. President Obama, in this crisis, has signed 3 executive orders authorizing sanctions, and we've been implementing those executive orders, and that's under U.S. domestic authorities. As Ambassador Nuland points out, as we move forward in this, we have been moving in conjunction and in coordination with the Europeans, but we are acting under our own authorities and taking action as we feel necessary. As Ambassador Nuland points out, especially as we move to the next phase of sanctions, which could more broadly impact sectors of the Russian economy, it's important that we are even more on the same page with our European counterparts, and that's what we're doing, precisely because the economies are so integrated. But we are prepared to work with our European allies to do exactly what we need to impose significant costs on the Russian economy.
Thank you. Mr. Royce, may I just follow up on that?
Yes, you certainly may, Ms. Frankel.
As you say, and then there were none here. You know what I think would also help for us to understand is what are the implications to the European economy with these sanctions, and why do we have to be careful?
I would just say broadly, and then invite Assistant Secretary Glazer. We need to ensure different European economies are more exposed, more vulnerable in different sectors. So as we look at sectoral sanctions, we're looking at sharing the burden across sectors. So no one European country is more impacted than another. That's one thing. And then some of them are vastly energy dependent. Some of them up to 100% on Russian energy. So they worry about retaliation. They worry about other vulnerabilities. And the last thing is, of course, as you know, European economies are just starting to grow again after 5 years of recession, so we don't want to throw them back into that.
I thought that was very well said. I don't have anything to add, Victoria.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Ms. Frankel, thank you. We are going to go now to Mr. Scott Perry of Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, folks, for your testimony. Phase 3 of the European Phased Adaptive Approach envisions the deployment of the Aegis Ballistic Missile Defense System and an advanced SM-3 interceptors, which Poland agreed to host in 2009 to counter short, medium, and intermediate-range missile threats. Now, some folks around town here are calling for the deployment of this system to be speeded up. I'm just asking, I want to ask, what practical challenges are there, if any, to accelerating the deployment of missile defense to Poland, and is this something that the administration is pursuing or considering pursuing?
Again, I would defer to the Missile Defense Agency for technical answer, but my understanding is it would be considerably more expensive, and there are technical challenges we haven't overcome if we were to try to accelerate. So there would be money that would have to go into technology and money that would have to go into speeding up the timetable. I think we are comfortable that the Phase 2 and Phase 3 are coming online as the threat develops, just to remind that this is designed not with Russia in mind, but with threats from Iran and elsewhere to the south.
So those technical questions, are they technical between the two countries or technical to the systems themselves, as far as you know?
My understanding, and again, I haven't wonked out on this in a long time, my understanding is that it goes to the technical readiness of the system inside the United States.
Okay. Moving on, I'm wondering if exporting LNG to Ukraine and Central Europe would be a prudent response to what's happening currently, and just what your thoughts on are as far as America increasing or working to increase, or having a policy and a policy statement and kind of a public statement in that regard, to what effect that would be, and if that's something that the administration is interested in pursuing in answer to what's currently occurring.
Well, certainly, as you know, we were already working intensively with Europe to energize, if you will, their internal energy market, to encourage them to make the investments in interconnectors, in efficiencies, in LNG terminals, to allow a more dynamic, cheaper market where Gazprom has to compete. Some of that's taking place through the third energy package. In terms of the immediate Ukrainian need, our primary focus is on reverse flow energy from Europe, reverse gas into Ukraine. We have a new agreement now between that we help broker between Slovakia and Ukraine that's going to get gas flowing reverse Also, Poland and Hungary are pushing gas into Ukraine. Over the medium term, we have U.S. companies investing in shale gas in Ukraine, and that has the potential to make them energy independent as soon as 8 to 10 years. With regard to U.S. exports, there is quite a lot of U.S. LNG on the market. It's going to Asia, though, because the price is higher. So here again, we have to create more opportunities and more dynamism in the European market as the best way for both Ukraine and other countries of Europe to resist monopoly pricing by Gazprom.
So the exports, the American exports that are currently going to Asia because the price is higher, is it reasonable to say that if we produce more, exported more, that the world market would then be able, the price would come down because there's more on, supply would be higher, and then make the viability of Ukraine receiving or Western Europe receiving some American LNG more viable?
Sorry, the most expedient thing that we could do to create a more vibrant LNG market across the Atlantic would be to complete work on our transatlantic trade and investment partnership agreement, the U.S. trade agreement with the EU, because once you're a preferential trade partner, you go to the head of the queue, if you will.
And I would agree with you on that. But so there's no viewpoint from the administration that increasing or setting the table from a policy standpoint to increase LNG exports from America is part of that equation, devoid of those other things that we already discussed?
Again, I think the President spoke about this quite a bit when he was in Europe, and I'm also not an LNG wonk, but he spoke about the fact that there is currently a lot of LNG coming from the U.S. on the world market, but we need to continue to look at it.
If the gentleman would yield.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
There is some LNG coming onto the market from the United States, but we have a glut on our market here in the United States. We have the capacity, at least in speaking to the representative of the LNG facility in Louisiana, we have the capacity to export into the market in Eastern Europe. By the end of the year, we will have receipt facilities in place in Lithuania and Poland that are currently being built. The question is, since the shipment of gas into those markets would represent additional export of gas, and given the attitudes of the administration on fossil fuels, can we get the administration out front on an initiative, which is the request by the government in Ukraine? The President, acting President spoke to this issue. The Prime Minister spoke to this issue. I think most of the presidential candidates we met with spoke to this issue. They are desirous of a commitment by the United States to ship gas to Ukraine, and it can be done through Poland, of course, now that the pipes have been reverse engineered. The administration seems to be on the other side of this argument. Certainly, we have had the initiative in the Energy and Power Subcommittee, and then the full committee on this issue that is coming before the floor, and Congress will probably force this issue, just as it has the question of the Keystone Pipeline. Another example where the administration has stood, because of its position on fossil fuels, against importing that asset into the United States. So I think what we're seeing is just an opposition to this policy based upon opposition to gas being a fossil fuel. We spent an hour talking with the Vice President about a number of issues in Kyiv. One of the ones we raised was trying to solicit his support for breaking the opposition and breaking the opposition to export of gas, and incorporating that into sort of an encompassing strategy that includes the very components that Ambassador Nuland spoke to, but including in that the export of gas, which is the prime interest of the government in Ukraine. The government in Ukraine making the point that the reason they're in this situation now is because they were whipsawed on the issue of gas by Russia, and that was manipulated to create the crisis, in their view anyway, inside the country that led to the current situation. So their point is, when Russia has the monopoly and when the United States doesn't announce a policy to come in and directly compete with that and drive down those prices and make this available, especially given the cooperation of Poland and Lithuania in trying to solve this equation, we're compounding the problem. So that was a big element of our discussions there. We now go to Mr. Doug Collins of Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As obviously the last participant, it looks like here today, most of this has been discussed. I think that one of the concerns is I know in talking to other members and member from Pennsylvania, we all share this one who has served and look at the issue on why we're here. I mean, we can get into the specifics, you know, is sanctions working, and I do believe that we're being too reactive in this regard, and Madam Ambassador, to say that we're reactive, and I know we have the issues of European nations that are concerned, but at the same point, if we continue to back off, their reserves are not going to stop Russia and Putin from doing this. I think it's sort of a false argument here as we look at it. So my question is we've been, I think, frankly, too reactive to the situations as a whole and not active enough. We do see them working. Iran sanctions work. They got to the table, although I think they should have been kept. That's not your area. Help me out here. What brought us to this in a sense of after it's happened and now, do you believe we're being too reactive? Was it prior policies that have led Russia to, given the fact that they think they can do this now? I'd like to hear your just thoughts more on a 30,000-foot level and not the, you know, the tactical level, I want to say your strategic level about where you believe what brought us to this point.
Well, that would probably be an 8-hour lunch, which we could have at some point. I think there are a lot of factors here, including Putin's own view of lost empire, his view of opportunity, his need for an external adventure to mask problems at home. Many things.
Madam Ambassador, I don't mean to interrupt here, but you brought up a great point there, and like I said, if you know, have a discussion over, you know, a cup of a glass of tea would be great. But you brought up something. We've known who Mr. Putin is. He is not a secret. He never has been a secret in his thoughts, his mindset, his whole thoughts. And then with us pulling back from missile defense, with us doing other things in Eastern Europe, I'm wondering, and frankly, I'm of the opinion that some of those actually gave, in the reactive way we have reacted around the world, gave an empowering sense to one who does have illusions of the former empire. I believe we've just been too reactive here, and I know there's the concerns of Eastern Europe, there's the concerns of others, and I know it's not in your place to say, yep, we've been too reactive, and I'm not going to put you in that. But in this discussion, I think you would at least acknowledge that that has to be part of the equation that we have to deal with going forward here. And should we be as reactive as we are and not be proactive? Because these same countries right now that are scared of their gas content and their relationship with Russia will be the same ones that turn to us if something else happens.
Congressman, I think that speaks to exactly the kind of deterrent that we have to put forward. That's why in the NATO context, for the NATO space, this reassurance mission where we are doubling down on land, sea, and air, we have to make it absolutely clear we'll defend our own space. But it also speaks to this issue of agreeing with the Europeans, as we did last week, that if he disrupts these elections, sectoral sanctions will be triggered, as compared to where we were a month before, which was that sectoral would be triggered by Russian forces coming over the border. We now see that he doesn't need to come over the border to upset. So we are continuing to reevaluate, but it also speaks to doing the hard work that we're doing now to develop a clear, demonstrable sectoral package that he can see, that he knows what it triggers as a deterrent, and to be ready if we have to use it.
I'm very concerned, though, he does not know the triggers. Because what we've done is we've set these sort of guidelines for, and then we react. Well, we put sanctions, then we react. And even with this agreement, you know, in looking with the other European nations, if he does this, well, you just said he didn't have to cross the border to cause chaos right now. And so is that the trigger? I mean, are we setting ourselves up to say, well, the trigger is he crossed the border, instead of saying the trigger is he's causing internal chaos in the Ukraine? Why is that not the discussion? Why are we limiting ourselves to a singular kind of focus instead of saying, well, it doesn't matter if you cross the border. You're causing chaos in the country. That should be the trigger. Why are we, again, still very reactive, in my opinion?
Well, Congressman, as you know, the last round of sanctions, which was about a week and a half ago, was precisely in response to the fact that we went to Geneva, we had an agreement on everybody supporting de-escalation, and the Russians did nothing thereafter, and therefore we hit 7 more people, we hit 17 entities, we blocked U.S. export of high technology in the defense sector. So as we work to build the sectoral package, there's also more headroom in this category of sanctions that we will continue to use if necessary.
Okay. Well, again, thank y'all for sitting through all this. It's always, I'm sure, fun for y'all to come up here and discuss and get many questions, but it is, I appreciate your answers. And I would like to see a lot more aggressiveness in this because, like I said, we're dealing with a man who does have, he's not an unknown quantity. It's not like he all of a sudden came out of nowhere and went to power. We know his background, and it's just very concerning to me that we're not a little more, because like I said, the Eastern European countries will be the very ones who will turn to us in a heartbeat if they're in trouble, irregardless of economic issues. So I do appreciate you both. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, thank you. And let's thank both the witnesses here, Ambassador Newland, Mr. Glazer. Thank you very much for your testimony. One of the key points that was reinforced in this hearing was the central importance of the May 25th elections. Those elections will be a watershed in Ukraine's history. The United States must do all it can to make certain that they're fair, they're free, and that people can safely get to the ballot box to cast their ballot in those elections. It's also clear that we need a more active and long-term strategy to undermine Russia's ability to use its oil and gas exports to coerce Ukraine. When they can turn off the gas in the dead of winter, when they get that chokehold over a government in Ukraine, you can see the consequences. So that is going to require the administration to end the sanctions that we have imposed upon ourselves. It's one thing to impose sanctions on Iran. It's another thing to impose gas and oil sanctions on the U.S. and not allow us at a time when we've got a glut on the gas market to put forward a strategy that will help our balance of payments, help our exports, and undermine Russia's monopoly in Eastern Europe. And lastly, I think we must also ramp up our international broadcasting efforts to counter Russia's propaganda. Only when the people of Ukraine and the region as a whole have access to objective information will democracy and peace have a chance to flourish there. Again, I thank our witnesses and the members, and we stand adjourned.